We'll try to keep this to, I don't know, under 2 hours.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
should be
we can do that
all right.
in this period of time.
All right.
What's going on, everybody? We are back. The Voy Boys in full effect. Dos Zekis. I'm joined today by my special guest, the big Signorelli, big Cigarelli
Big Signorelli.
himself,
The
about to
forgetting.
reconstruct through productive forgetting the desire that lies in wait
Exactly. We're
for
about
all
to
of us.
Freudian slip you some new facts, some new
That's
knowledge.
right. Don't get caught slipping
What are
by
we
the
going over
analyst.
today?
What's
Today,
up?
what's the topic today?
Today, we're going to talk about three of my favorite topics: one, Freud; two, Hegel; and three, the machine.
Right.
That's right. Here we go. We're going to jump right back into it. When we last left our hero, he was talking a little bit about repetition. What were we talking about before that? The
Right.
restitutive function.
Exactly. So we were talking about in the last one, like homeostasis and insistence, that right, homeostasis in like biology is like, a sort of like going back to like a harmony of like the organism, or like equilibrium. But then you have insistence on this one hand, which is on the level of drive, or the death instinct. Right here in the beginning, uh Lacan gives like some remarks on what Hippolyte had to say, and also pointing out the translation of uh, the original German term for the compulsion to repeat as such, rather than like how it's translated, I guess, in French as like uh, automatic repetition. Is rather this compulsion, rather than like this automaton or automatism of anything that could be related to like something of like instinct. Even though we're using the term death instinct, it should be known as trieb, right? Death drive. And uh, we're also going over, which is pretty interesting, we're getting more into like a sort of analysis of like that Freud isn't biologizing or being reductive by trying to reduce everything down to biological functions. Rather, it's like seeing this as like a metaphor, or as he says, like in the later of the chapter, like a myth for describing energy. I think he uses the term like anti-Francis or whatever, like a sort of ironical use of the term. And that's what we should think of as biology for Freud, at least. Yeah, anti-Phrasis. Am I pronouncing it right?
Beats me.
Yeah.
Why do you think why does he want it to be compulsion to repeat rather than automism of
Uh,
repetition, in your opinion?
well, I think that's what's supposed to be like the translation for it, the correct translation of the German term, Wiederholungsschwang, terrible German. But I think what it shows is like this is like something that, as we'll get into the chapter, is so we have two distinctions. We have the restitution function, right, and the repetition. And I think that what this shows is like the difference in the two is like a restitution, restoring of an organism, and the function has a lot to do with um, this sort of, again, equilibrium, right? And what evolutionary biology or physiology at the time sees organisms as like, yeah, they do get into these variables of like, oh, stress, um, or like the environment becomes overwhelming, especially with the reality principle in Freud. But there's still this like always this telos to a sort of equilibrium, a sort of self harmony of the organism or the subject in a Darwinian sense. But that flies in the face when we talk about like compulsion. Repetition, on the other hand, is something to do with like obviously repeating something. We see this in the use of the death drive, but there's something that flies in the, at least I would say, like kind of really shows that both of these terms fail, right? In a sort of way of that we can look at repetition in like a sort of like physiological habitual function of like certain organisms having a certain like pattern for survival. But if there is this like dialectic between the two, they both fail because there is this compulsion, not on just the level to repeat or to restore, but that both of them fail because of this insistence of the death instinct or the death drive, right? Which we see as a failure on both ends, failure for evolutionary success in a Darwinian sense, and also of some type of habit on the instinctual level to maintain homeostasis or equilibrium.
Nice. So then we have like this remark here that the writings of an author like Hartman,
right,
principle of constancy, pleasure principle, and the nirvana principle are all identified as one and the same thing. And I know that a lot of people tend to think of the pleasure principle as aiming towards something like nirvana or the cessation
right,
of all life for the sake of inertia, as
right,
if inertia itself were a principle, that a guiding principle of the pleasure principle, and that all of life was aimed at a sort of return to an insentient
right.
state,
And
if that's a word,
no,
non-sentient
yeah,
state.
yeah. And that's true because like even in the beyond the pleasure principle is something that is supposed to reduce the amount of excitation, but it's never like the complete satiation of any type of entropy or excitation, jouissance, if you want to be Lacanian about it, because to do that would be death. The nirvana principle is synonymous with death because the nirvana principle is the satiation of all pleasure, unpleasure, excitation. So pleasure principle is sort of reducing dissatisfaction or, as he says, unpleasure. And it's cool because like something like Hartman is very influential on like Jung. Hartman is definitely like a teleological thinker, more of a vitalist way of expressing the unconscious as something of more of a creative impulse or function in a romantic sense, rather than this sort of thing that tries to take itself into account and so far breaks down any form or principle of self-determination, agency, or a positive telos.
What do you think that Freud would have said about the pleasure principle prior to Beyond the Pleasure Principle vis-a-vis what interrupts the pleasure principle? Would it
Right.
only be external circumstances that he would have considered as interrupting the pleasure principle? And would he have thought that the pleasure principle had an automism or a thrust of its own that was all powerful in a sense?
It would seem like that, and I think this is what like Lacan is trying to get at to show that that's not the case. That Freud's death drive is actually like the way I'm gonna like kind of make it analogous to is like the way like theory of ideology is like in the blueprints of all of Marx's work, but it wasn't like a complete theory until like later on, right? Same thing with like death drive contra the pleasure principle. And this is what he's saying, like in the Project for Scientific Psychology, we see something of the death drive manifesting itself within the organism, because it's not just on the level of the reality principle that stultifies like any sort of pleasure, but also the internal mechanisms and defenses of that organism, which undermine itself, especially on the level of restitution and repetition, right? Obviously, things of the reality principle do take burden, right? But we could see this on a behavioristic level, why this doesn't account for a lot, because like we could see the reality principle, maybe not in like this exact semantical notion of using the reality principle in like behaviorism, but something like that, like the environment impacting me, right? We see this like as like, oh, in cognitive behavioral therapy, the environment has an effect on your behavior, on your emotion, on your thoughts, but that's like purely like on a cognitive physiological level, right? And they'll say like, oh yeah, you know, due to evolution, the way you freak out whenever like something bad goes wrong, like, you know, your boss yells at you, you go in a fight or flight mode, or you want to go and like kind of like burrow yourself like into a place of security. It's very similar to like, you know, finding shelter whenever like we were primitives and hunter and gatherers, like, and we needed to get away from the storm, or like a vicious animal was trying to attack us. Like, they kind of relate it to these type of weird like biological things, but it's still to a level of like homeostasis, whereas like the death drive is something that kind of sublates both, right? But it's not for like some type of like synthesis or totalization, but rather a failure.
Right. So the whole idea was that before Freud discovered the death drive,
Right.
his only elaboration, I could be wrong about this, but his main elaboration on the pleasure principle was the reality principle, which would have been an attendant concept that is really ultimately an extension of the pleasure principle that takes into account external variables that could,
Right.
in some ways, be counterproductive to the movement of the pleasure principle. And he was mostly operating under the assumption that the pleasure principle achieved its aim of homeostasis at any cost, and that the homeostasis really is the end and purpose of all life.
Because you can see like there is this like split between both the reality principle and the pleasure principle, like two different aims, right? One, the variables of reality that pretty much give a lot of like change, dynamism, and entropy upon the organism, and then the pleasure principle is like this restitution and satisfaction of being able to get rid of this minimize the excitation that could be coming from the reality principle. But going back to like other essays, we see how Freud is kind of onto something when we look at like the narcissism essay, right? This grandiose sense of self, in which it is jeopardizing towards the subject. Even this notion of two different drives, of the ego drive and the libido drive, but still creates like a sort of dualism, but not something that is like a Cartesian dualism, but more of like still a problem both to try to constitute them as having their own mutually exclusive aims, especially when it comes to the ego. And as we see in the optical schema, it's like the primary and secondary narcissism still depend upon the formation of libido alienating itself vis-a-vis the fragmented body image, right?
So there are antecedents of the death drive throughout Freud's work. You would say from the very beginning, he's dealing with a dyad or dualism that creates a lot of quandaries for him that he attempts to resolve. And then it's only with his dealings with patients who are suffering from war neuroses that he's able to finally flesh out a new concept that sort of hammers home themes he had been dealing with throughout his entire career. But it took a world war, in a sense, for him to ultimately be able to come to the conclusion that there was something else at work within the psyche. It's not necessary. And I think it's not necessarily diametrically opposed to the pleasure principle, but the way he outlines the interaction between death drive, which is not a principle. I think it's interesting, the sort of terminology that we're using here. It's a drive. That would imply movement, whereas pleasure principle is something more abstract in a way. But the two interact in such a way that it's neither the interaction between the two I wouldn't consider harmonious, nor would I consider them exactly mutually opposed either. That's the interesting thing.
And I think it's so cool how like the name of this title is Freud, Hegel, and the Machine, and how we tie in more of like the phenomenology of spirit and putting an investigation, an immanent critique. With the dialectic, we see how Freud was doing the same thing with the science of his day in which he was situated in, physiology and the growth of psychology, and psychophysicists like Fechner, I think that's, or Fechnel or whatever his name is. And I think things like the reality principle and the pleasure principle are something that have more of a psychophysical sort of dimension to them, and he's kind of putting them into dialogue to see where they fail in relation to his new studies, and also the findings of things like the war trauma, the war neuroses, shell shock, or you know, whatever. And people like Bion, because Bion, I think, was investigating this simultaneously with Freud. And then I forget the actual psychiatrist or psychologist that was actually putting into investigation the understanding of the war trauma. But the thing that they weren't doing, though, was like what Freud was doing was actually having analysis with these people and seeing that through the transference, the compulsion to repeat manifests itself. And you see the repetition of the behavior, even when they're trying to restore themselves while working through and historicizing the subjectivity, that there's always this repetition at a point of failure.
So here Lacan attempts to elucidate this concept of the libido by contrasting the sexual libido as Freud understands it with the Jungian notion of libido as something spiritual, desexualized, creative, of which, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, there is for Jung one form of the libido that's sexualized, but that would only be a specific iteration of it.
Well, I think he would say that in the development that libido is sexual, but its aim is to transubstantiate itself into something of psychical investment. And this is a problem for Freud, and it's obviously a problem for Lacan as well, because this like shows that there's this creative and assertive, affirmative function, and it has an aim to transform. And to understand, like with Jungian metapsychology, and even like in clinical practice, there's no aspect of the death drive in them. It's like the level of when we talk about like the ego and its shadow, right, as something of a barrier, hindrance, in forms of like repression. But then the libido is trying to transform itself through these dream symbols, through creating mythic things like complexes. And this is not something that's too far off from a Freudian, because the Freudian complex is the Oedipal complex. But then you get into these other things that are very divergent, but not too far off as a Oedipus, like, you know, in the meme about like the queer, the father, the mother complex, right? But these don't really lead to a compulsion to repeat for Jung when they start to become more clear and concise in the transference. There's always this, and this is why you kind of see Jung kind of having an element of ego psychology, because to make the dreams or the complex conscious from the unconscious is to restore agency to the ego, to kind of water it down a little bit. Look at Joseph Campbell's like the hero's journey. That's like a way of reconstituting the ego in an affirmative way, a telos. We are seeing the exact opposite, and to kind of cut it down, because I'm talking a lot. This is why
talk.
This is why like sexuality is a lot better to use for libido, because for psychic libido, again, it's a telos, it has this interest. For sexuality, it's a failure, and it always refines its object of satisfaction, but can never get it. We could look at now, if we reflect now and back then, look at like people like Zupančič and Zizek who have reaffirmed this through philosophy, right? Look at sex and the fail absolute. Look at what is sex, right? The sexuality is like pretty much the impossibility, right? And it's always like impossible because it can never get its object of satisfaction.
Right. And it can't get its object of satisfaction because the circuitousness, the circularity of the drive is of such a form that it
right
only aims at its own continuation. In order to do that, it actually has to circle an absence.
Right, exactly.
And in order to circle the absence, an object must be posited in the place of that.
Yeah.
We get desire there. Desire is metonymic, in that desire is always sparkling in some sense, or scintillating in a way that's like it's always in constant motion. The object, once it's closed in upon, changes shape, becomes something else. And what's going on there is that the absence around which the drive is circling is masked through the metonymy of desire. And because the object's always changing,
yeah, I would definitely
the drive gets its satisfaction because it is the movement itself that it's aiming at, if that makes any sense.
And I think with death drive, it's always like that's what makes it fail, is because it tries to master the object, right, or master the scene for the object in which created that instance of the trauma, of the in a sense sort of need for reconstituting, if that makes sense. Not just a repetition, but always a structuring of one's own identity in relation to the lack. It's definitely very interesting. And like, to kind of go off on a tangent, we could like just a small one, like philosophically, you could see why, like when you look at the two schools of thought of like the dialectic, and then like you got like Zizek, Zupančič using Lacan, and then when you look at like the post-structuralists, mainly Deleuze, one is on negativity, the other one is on like a sort of affirmation and vitalism, right? And why, like, even though somebody like Deleuze and Guattari would say that libido is sexual, desire has some sexuality, it's never on sublimation, right? Because they hate negativity. And so therefore, like, they kind of like appropriate like Jung and Freud, or not Jung and Freud, Jung and Nietzsche, right? Because they're both a sort of like affirmation of a certain vitalism and dynamism of life, a will to power. Whereas like someone like Freud and Lacan, it's like this negativity that comes from Hegel and its failure, right?
Right. Or like it's the inconsistency,
right,
that's ultimately emphasized by Lacan and many readers of Hegel don't necessarily emphasize that aspect of his system. And he's often criticized for putting forth an explanation of the ontological reality of knowledge that would, from a superficial reading, seem to suggest that what he's talking about is something totally totalizable, complete,
Right.
self-contained, absolute closure. People reject his system on the basis of this very fundamental misconception that they have of it, when the reality is Hegel seems to be alluding to, or not just alluding to, he seems to be absolutely pursuing a kind of logic that would define knowledge as something that is ultimately heterogeneous and which is one and the same, not with its object, but with the path it takes. So he does, without realizing it unconsciously, he doesn't have a concept of the unconscious, but he unconsciously is pursuing something that has the same kind of homologous structure as the drive itself, in my opinion. But I'm not a Hegel expert, but I think that's what Zizek sees in Hegel. And maybe we are adumbrating something similar here with
Yeah, I think so too. I think so.
with Lacan.
Right, with the relation of substance and subject as substance, with that, even though it separates itself from the world to try to have absolute knowledge, right, of the object, of the substance, it's also reorienting itself, and it always fails when it stays in the guidelines of these two things of empiricism and rationalism. Both try to find a fixed framework or model of knowledge and representation. One, oh, if we could learn about the world particularly, and then kind of did induce, or the fact of like independent reality as it is without human cognition or perception, pretty much through perception, observation, and the senses and empirical investigation, we can develop an objective model of truth independent of human consciousess. Whereas it's like, no, the world kind of is, in the whole kind of Leibnizian, Spinoza's, and to an extent, and Descartes, like through rational deduction, through sort of geometrical assumptions and apodictic reason, we could actually come up to like eternal truths outside of the world of appearances, like knowledge of God, right, through argumentation, knowledge of myself by doubting everything, right, I just know that I think, and overall the immortality of the soul, which obviously Kant critiques, but Hegel takes it to a new level by showing that the failures of all these schools, and it always leads back to a new beginning, to construct a new type of framework from that point of failure. I think, to bring it down to the level of psychoanalysis, through the failure of libido and its sexual object, it always finds itself anew in a refining of the object, right? This is something that's in Freud's three essays on sexuality. And I think there is also this kind of really retroactivity to this in looking at the mirror stage. That the mirror stage is not a developmental process of like, it's a metaphor, right? And I think that what the mirror stage is actually showing is something that happens after the point of failure. Then there is a refining of the object, and that object is one's own alienated image that could only be identified not only from just the single point of the mirror stage, but also the plane mirror that creates the secondary narcissism, seeing yourself in relation to others and how you wish to want to be seen and how you will be in the future, so that you could have this sense of wholeness, which is the ideal ego.
And don't you think, though, also for Hegel, it's sort of the notion of alienation is definitely a motive force behind much of his thinking, in that the whole idea of first as subject, then as substance, or is it first as substance, then as first as subject, then as substance? The whole idea is that so that which was alienated by substance and by its presuppositions in some sense becomes the retroactive source of those presuppositions.
I
And
think
assumes those presuppositions as its own self-generated cause.
right.
The subject seemed at one point to be a necessary precondition of the substance, which was all powerful, but then there's a reversal that happens there. The same happens in psychoanalysis, where one assumes the cause of their desire, assumes they're unconscious from the standpoint of a kind of ethics that would mark that person as responsible for even those things that they are unconscious of.
Right. And I really like what you were saying. Like, so like, I don't think it really matters unless we really want to be exact about Hegel, but it's like, who really wants to fucking know Hegel to the T? But when you're saying like first as subject, then as substance, or first as substance, then as subject, if we play on both with the history of philosophy, right? First as substance, then as subject, we have that in Plato and Aristotle. Now, Plato never talked about substance, right? He talks about the forms. But there's no notion of subjectivity in either or, right? The soul is not subjectivity, right? It's a form. And it's something that's, you know, more true than the simulacrum or the body. There's substance in Aristotle. But then when we look at how Hegel plays with this in how Stoics, right? It's only with Stoicism and like with a Roman legal system that we get this internalization of a subject, right? Of an individualism. One on the level of property, what still is in relation to an object, a law, but then we have on the one hand with Stoicism, this rejection of the external world because they can't control it and I can just only control my temperament and my virtues. So I will retract inward, right? And focus on that maybe this plays in with force and understanding, but then there's this, right? But then when you have this development of the self, then you have the Lord and bondsman dialectic of I can only know myself, right? I try to know myself and posit myself, but as soon as the other comes into being, then there is this like battle of supremacy and a risk of losing symbolic, of being symbolically dead, not physically dead, but symbolically in my own agency. So therefore, it's my own self as subject gets taken out by another person trying to posit themselves as subject in a world where they're trying to find out about substance.
And what becomes paradoxical about that whole struggle is the fact that your agency is constituted by, is rooted in your alienation.
Yeah.
Which is the only fact of life that you can really rely upon, is the thoroughgoing alienation that permeates all of existence. This is why attempts to try to synthesize Lacan and Hegel with any kind of totalizing worldview, let's say, I don't know, forms of Christianity and stuff like that, are doomed to failure because you are going to look for any excuse whatsoever to unsplit, to quote Mikey, unsplit the split subjectivity, and then you throw the baby out with the bathwater, because that is what Lacan is all about, is the ineradicability of that split.
Right. So Manoni's question is pretty interesting.
Manoni, let's get into the man himself.
His remark. He says right here, I would very much like to ask for clarification on a point which troubles me a little. It seems when reading Freud that he maintains there are two aspects of the compulsion to repeat. And one, it is a matter of renewing an attempt that has failed so as to make it succeed. This takes the form of protection against danger, against trauma. In the other, it seems that one reverts to a more comfortable position because one has failed to attain the position which from an evolutionary perspective is posterior. I can't see how these two positions are finally made to agree, or at least I've missed the agreement, and I'm troubled by this difficulty.
I was confused by this distinction he's making here. So he's troubled, and I'm troubled by the distinction that he's trying to make because I don't understand the latter
Right. And this is what
definition.
I was trying to talk about earlier, and I think like now that I have this as a reference point, it kind of furthers what I was trying to get at, is that there is this failure in one of a protection from danger against trauma, right? Whatever trauma may be. But then we have this resort back to a more comfortable position. Both seem to rely heavily on an evolutionary aspect, right? For evolution, survival of the species, right, and natural selection needs to maintain itself for the evolution and growth and development of that organism, to fly away from other external dangers or traumas that could be just like, not like psychoanalytic trauma, but something like of just the fact of something external, like a storm, or like a freaking vicious predator, like I said before. But then on the other level, it's like the inability to handle these situations is a regress by something of a more comfortable position, or something a more attuned to like habits, right? And I think Freud is trying to get beyond this, because both seem to resort to a level of the pleasure principle no matter what, and it never seems to aim at that.
Is that where this notion of entropy or inertia comes in,
Right.
or just dead matter?
Yes, yeah. And if we look at like inertia and specifically, like that is such an abstract concept from like in a Newtonian physics aspect, because there's no such thing as something that's purely inert. Everything is in motion, right? It's just an abstract starting point, mathematically speaking, you know, and it's thing like an object in rest stays at
It's a
rest.
reification of that
Right.
abstract starting point ultimately.
Exactly.
So how does our boy handle Manoni's confusion?
Yeah, and it's like what so like what Lacan is saying is like he references like Pontilis's what he's observed, like he says right here, there's two registers intermingling, interweaving a restitutive and a repetitive tendency between the two. But he's like trying to say that Freud is not trying to like say that they kind of like seesaw on each other in a way that it's like, oh, this is what we're dealing with. It's rather something else, like in this paradoxical thing, that the death drive is rather like a sort of failure of both, like what I was trying to say before. Like both are split and indeterminate, these like restitution function and this repetitive function of like a sort of repetition to a more comfortable thing that's going to determine I get pleasure and satisfaction and get rid of unpleasure. And restoration seems like to be on the level of trying to move forward, whereas repetition is more about like going to the old. Restoration, it seems like to be more progressive in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I'm at least interpreting it.
One's not necessarily more primordial than the other. They're one and the same action. They're one and the same aim, even though they manifest themselves differently. Because the whole idea is sort of like the unconscious is to consciousness what here unpleasure is to pleasure, in that he doesn't want to define either of those as pure dichotomies only because one is in the negative and one is in the positive.
Right.
He says, I think I quoted this last time, but in television, when he says that the phrase l'inconscient or whatever in French, the unconscious has the unfortunate property of being of necessarily being stated in the negative, when we shouldn't understand it as something that's purely well, it is purely negative in many ways, but it's not the negation of something that is prior and positive.
Right.
Because the pleasure principle, it was the star of the show for
Yeah.
a very long time. And it's as if, okay, it gets upstaged by the death drive. But the idea is that for Freud, he doesn't just jettison the pleasure principle. A lesser mind might just get rid of the pleasure principle altogether. Freud doesn't do that. He reframes what the pleasure principle is all about.
Right.
So
And
it's as if the pleasure principle was this all along. It needs to be understood within the context of Death Drive.
Yeah. And like in reframing it, it shows its limits and that its aim is a sort of impossibility.
Let me ask you this though: is that in trying to reveal its limits, is it its theoretical limits, or are we talking about something that, how did you describe it before? Psychic, is that the word you used? Or
Yeah, I was like a psychic psychophysicist kind of thing, like kind of adding like this like sort of like physics and energy model to sort of
right. So is it the limits of the theory itself as a quasi philosophical guiding principle, or is it the fact that what we understand about it is limited from this psychophysical standpoint?
I think it's both on the level of the theory, but also in the fact it's like, well, if when we look of how he's dealing with his patients, the failure of a sort of agency or determination towards pleasure, well, like the agent, like a sort of agency and drive towards satisfaction and pleasure fails in all these models when you try to apply it to psychoanalysis, especially with how the compulsion to repeat operates in the transference. Obviously, there's more repetition when we talk about like instances of working through of how the drive and the compulsion to repeat manifests in the dreams and in the sort of acting out and resistances in the transference, in sort of the failures of speech and a sort of regression, like back to certain modes of behavior, right? But they all fail because it's more of like, if we take up like, well, what is exactly trying to find pleasure, right? I wouldn't say it's on the level of the unconscious where the pleasure principle is, but rather on sort of mirroring on the level of the ego and the imaginary.
Now, is it safe to say that the pleasure principle furnishes the death drive with the aim that it fails to hit in order for it to reach its goal of, sometimes Zizek uses the expression satisfaction,
Right.
the satisfaction of the, as opposed to pleasure, the satisfaction of the drive in its circularity, but they work in tandem in a sense, and that it's like what we were talking about in one of our best episodes, I think, when we talk about Verneinung, this idea of expulsion and introjection, where what's good is taken in, what's bad is expelled,
Right.
and what's good is identified with, what's bad is seen as other, and this is how the pleasure ego is formed, and that's a purely imaginary process, and that it has to do with an image. Anytime we talk about totality, or like anything that is in some sense self-subsistent or has a basic, the illusion of a complete frame and containment, we're talking about the image.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. Especially like with that, like that, and that's like a problem of object relations with understanding like the ego and its expulsion, introduction, projection. It's always on identification, right, of the ego. Even if the ego is like splitting, it's not whole. It's still like there are more unconscious aspects of the ego from my understanding of object relations, but it's not dealing with the Freudian unconscious in the way that Lacan wants to go back to, in the way that it takes itself into account with these different combinations of signifiers. But it takes itself into account upon this failure. The failure happens because of the resistance of symbolization, of taking itself into account as language, right? And it's the real, we talk about death drive here, but like we're thinking of in terms of the symbolic, but this is the real, right?
And it's worth pointing out, I don't think we've highlighted this very crucial point enough in these episodes, but talking to Mikey should be on the channel soon.
Right.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. He was saying, and Todd McGowan also backed this point up, that the at this stage in Lacan's thinking, the real is reality.
Right.
He's still adhering to
Right.
a kind of naive realism of a thing in itself, something that exists behind the phenomenological veil of the imaginary. And he is nearing a concept of the real in this notion of the machines malfunctioning, but he doesn't quite have it yet. Or I don't know.
Right.
Would you disagree with that?
Well, I would say that no, that like that is correct. Like he's talking about reality in and of itself, but like I just want to add this before I keep elaborating. I'm going to split my ego and identify projectively with the audience that we should say that the reality principle or reality in itself for Lacan as the real is not the same as the reality principle, in what Freud is talking about, but like sort of like this, like noumena type thing, and like where we would get Das Ding eventually, like in the later seminars, like before like seminar 8 and 9, 10, 11, and so on, when we get like objet and all that. It seems like it like Das Ding is like this reality itself, right? Reality in itself seems to have more philosophical implications, something more ontological, than what we would see as the real, as like the impossibility of symbolization, and that which always leads to failure. It's the point of failure where like the real is located.
Hippolyte, the homie, I like how they're mic sparring here,
Yeah.
going back and forth. It's kind of like MGM on Wu-Tang Forever.
Yeah.
Great song.
Good song.
Very overlooked. They're kind of going back and forth. We have a similar dynamic here. I like Hippolyte always asks the best questions. He's the best adversary of Lacan. And you notice Lacan defers to him at different points when he
Right.
talks about Hegel. He's like, maybe Hippolyte would contradict me here, but blah, blah, blah. Hippolyte asks a really good question here, which is why he calls it death instinct.
Rather than
Why death? Because death, I think, sounds, it suggests something that's very univocal and has one aim in particular.
right.
But that's only because we have a very limited idea of what death is, I think.
Right. And the fact that like as being like if we take Freud as a linguist, in the way Lacan says, it's like we should see death as metaphorical and not sort of this like bringing in a new principle to where we have this like sort of Manichaeanism between life and death, and the way that like this image of Freud after Freud of like Thanatos and Eros, right, as the principles of reality that govern the psyche, right? You have one angel and one devil on your shoulder. Like that's right. How it kind of seems by like all these like sort of revisionists the way like Marcuse Bros do, and like even like somebody like Julius Evola, right? Like these occultists, like appropriate like these like concepts for their own like philosophical uses. He's not getting at that at all, right?
And what are those systems predicated on, if not a cosmological and
Right.
cosmogonic sexual relation, a complementarity between two essences? And then we're just back where we always start, which is a yin yang kind of, oh, it all fits together, keyhole. Oh, the boner fits into the hoo-ha, and that's why we have like, and it's just great. Then we have no original ideas then.
Yeah.
That's how I initiate. That's how I initiate when I'm getting to third base. That's what I say. The boner fits into the hoo-ha.
Literally, like on the 40-year-old virgin when he's at that sex ed therapy, or just so fascinated by the little freaking diagram of the vagina.
I have to rewatch that. It's so good, but
that's how they are with Eros and Thanatos.
I like this part though. He's like, well, I call it death instinct. And Manoni's like, he would have been better off calling it anti-instinct. This is like the record
so
scratch.
original.
This is like the because
yeah, Captain Obvious right there. It's literally
cool anti-instinct. Lacan's like, I'm not even gonna touch that. Like, stop it. But they're both sort of pontificating now about death instinct and the semantics of it, and it shouldn't be baptized that. But I like what Hippolyte's saying here, and he describes the chapter perfectly, or I mean he describes Freud's speculations perfectly as sort of a series of enigmas, and that's one of the things that makes Beyond the Pleasure Principle such a strange and unique and unprecedented sort of work, is that the tone that most thinkers, psychologists, philosophers take in their works is usually that of someone who has reached the finish line and is recapping how he got there. They're walking you through their argument to get to the point, to the concluding point. But in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it's like you are right there alongside Freud, who is articulate and rational to the very end, has this sort of talk about mastery, a mastery of the terms that he's using, and yet is baffled at every turn. That's what makes it so fascinating, and that's what makes, we've talked about this before, but that's what makes Freud such an original and compelling thinker.
And what I really like about how you describe that, and it's so true, the way he's wording everything and just like in dialogue with a lot of the concepts, from looking at the war neuroses to his grandson of his Port Dot, to understanding like the distinctions between pleasure and unpleasure rather than pleasure and pain, right? So interesting how he uses that, talking about like the psychophysicists, things about energy, but it's always in this more inquiry and investigation, not something to be taken as face value. He wants to see the limits of these concepts. I like it reminds me of like the writing style on here of like what Deleuze says in the beginning of Difference of Repetition, that we should see philosophy as a sort of detective novel or detective work, where in each new location that you go for blueprints and stuff like that, and sort of gathering all the evidence, it changes you at the same time, because a detective changes as the scene of the crime changes in his understanding and his reliving of what had happened there, right? And it seems like that's exactly what's on the level of Freud in his investigation.
Absolutely. And it's Lacan is going to say Freud is rational to the end, but not
Right.
logic bro type rational. What distinguishes Freud as a thinker is the fact that he doesn't shy away from the yawning abyss that his thinking opens up. And what he does is something that, to my mind, goes against Wittgenstein's famous dictum, that which we cannot speak upon, we must pass over in silence.
Yeah.
I think I got this from Zizek, but what the hell? I'll
Oh
take
yeah.
credit for it right now. Why
Yeah.
not? No, I definitely got it from him somewhere. But like this idea of no, but okay, fine. Well, we cannot speak upon. There are things we cannot speak upon. Why should we pass them over in silence? That's what distinguishes a thinker like Freud. Let's take our little fantastic voyage vessel and plumb the depths. Let's go as far as we possibly can. And it's not to draw some sort of, not to make some final, definitive, totalizing statement, but you can, through reason, actually trace the contours of a kind of thought. That's what
Right.
Beyond the Pleasure Principle does.
Right, and it seems like with somebody like Wittgenstein, it's like they were able to critique a lot of the positivists and analytic philosophers, but it's like in doing so, they would have like they would want to remain silent lest they have to literally take the own framework of where they're working through, which is in analytic philosophy. Even if they want to be considered like a post-analytic philosopher, right? Someone like Wittgenstein. To remain silent means they can still maintain that reference point and safeguard of being in the analytic tradition, lest they find
Oh.
themselves destroying that framework and then they end up in this like sort of like I guess impasse or like symbolic death, right?
Well, what's interesting about that, and this is a common criticism of scientism, but it's a naive sort of criticism that comes from spiritual folk, which is that, oh, all of these materialist thinkers, these science bros, they don't leave any margin for doubt or for the spiritual. And
Right.
it's kind of a straw man argument because it's like actually like a lot of these Neil deGrasse Tyson, maybe not Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's not a good example, but like a lot of these type science bros do ultimately fall back on a Wittgensteinian argument that yes, there are things, there is a something that is ineffable, and they'll either say maybe science will get there one day, maybe it won't get there one day, only time will tell. But oh, everybody for the most part who thinks that way, they leave some room for the unknown, some little sliver of space for the unknown, and call it the ineffable, that
Right.
which we cannot speak upon. What
Yeah, and
Freud's doing is something much more radical in that no, we can, in a sense, we're not speaking upon anything in particular, but we can talk. We can talk
right.
about it. We can write about it. We can think about it. We can. It's there's a tangible, not tangibility, but there's a shape to the emptiness.
No, yeah, exactly. And it's just like if you maintain the science, it's like it gives ground relative to the desire of these like spiritual bros that would be like, well, what science is talking about now, religious sages and all these of the ancient past have already spoke about first. Like if and it falls into again like the to be antiquated or like going back to something that just seems so filled with such novelty is much better than modernity because it fills with resentment of modernity and the things that come with like technology and all this stuff. So that's why it seems more appealing to go back to these scriptures and stuff rather than having some critical thinking in the sense of like critical theory of like what Jacques, uh, the post-structuralists, etc. Like as far as critical theory of the Frankfurt School of really being critical not only of just science but even like the humanities and of religion itself, while still maintaining that there are some things that you still have to be immersed in and have an immanent critique, not like this neutral stance outside.
Imminent critique.
Right, an immanent critique.
Which is what Freud opens the field towards, I think, here. And I believe Lacan would agree with us here. It is speculative. He's of, as he says here, he's of necessity brought down the path of this problematic. He follows the logic of something beyond him, which seems to almost frighten him in some sense, and brings us to a point where something very inconclusive is given body.
Right.
That's the difference, is that what's inconclusive and undefined or indefinable in some sense is treated differently by Freud than most thinkers, because many thinkers, many theoreticians, psychologists, whoever reach that point, but they don't, in some sense, bring it back into their system as something that shapes it from within.
Right.
That's what Freud does.
Yeah.
And that's what, to me, the beyond the pleasure principle is, from what I understand. But let's get back into the text itself.
To Brian Becker.
The what?
To quote Brian Becker, back to the text themselves.
Back to the text themselves. Yep. Unconsciously channeling the homie. Hopefully,
yeah.
With some luck, we'll have him back on. I think he's open to the idea of it. I would love to talk to him at this juncture.
Right. No,
we're on similar paths. If you haven't watched his videos, I would say that they're the best starting point for this stuff. I like to think that what we're doing complements what he's doing really well, and that the two together really help create an understanding of the seminars. But so is there anything here that you think we haven't covered exactly in this back and forth? Should we skip to Hegel now? He finally
I think
Hegel.
We covered a lot. I think I just want to say last thing right here is that this very, very provocative question of, is psychoanalysis a humanism, right?
Right.
And it's because of the fact of, well, what is humanism? It's going to be the sort of zeitgeist idea that's going on for the time of phenomenology, right? And even when we look at, like, during this era, there was a lot of hesitation in the Marxist community too in France. And so the Sino-Soviet split and all that led to different, oh, we're Stalinists, no, we're Maoists. And then these sort of Marxist intellectuals, even like not just in phenomenology, but also like in the Frankfurt School, people like Marcuse, Erich Fromm, were getting influenced by these like existentialist thinkers. So there was back towards a Marxist humanism, sort of a placeholder on like not just the freeing of the proletariat, but also of human agency and freedom and autonomy. And we see this in Sartre as well with his phenomenology, with, you know, existence before essence. Existentialism is humanism. Even Merleau-Ponty has a humanism of his own in sort of a lived experience and the lived body, which we'll get into in the circuit for the next episode. But so far, we'll just take it right here. This is what is meant by humanism for Lacan. Is psychoanalysis humanism? For those of you who aren't aware, we went to the Lacan Circle, or a conference that happened October 14th through the 16th, Culture and Clinic. And there was a beautiful lecture on the comparison of Fanon and Lacan, and they drew a lot from each other. But the distinction between Fanon is Fanon wanted emancipation and freedom, Whereas Lacan doubted that there could be such a thing because of the bonds of language and of desire. I think this is something that we're going to build up to, but also mainly because of the death drive or death instinct, it really eliminates any groundwork for the possibility of self-determination.
So humanism is freedom, is a vision of the human subject which has as its horizon of meaning and possibility
Right.
an emancipatory kind of freedom.
Right.
And
yeah.
Lacan, I think it was in that talk where we got this from, but he scoffed at the concept of freedom in a sense.
Right.
And yet at the same time, he wouldn't probably agree with the naively scientific view of the human individual as someone who's completely determined by outside forces. He uses the metaphor of a puppet here,
Right.
but I don't think it's the puppet of predestination, the puppet of a naively scientific worldview, which completely abandons or cuts the Gordian knot, let's say, of the question of free will. Actually, let me take that back. What Lacan's doing is cutting the Gordian knot of the question of free will, whereas there's a kind of scientific, often atheistic sort of point of view, which postulates that man does not determine any of their own actions. Everything is dependent on the stimuli encountered. Again, we're just atoms, and there's only a kind of psychic illusory effect that occurs, which would see our actions as, in some sense, self-originated, but it's just an illusion. There's some of that in Lacan, but it's more complicated than that. And actually, Zupancic talks about this in Ethics of the Real, which is that there is a kind of freedom, but freedom is an abyss. To an extent, the scientific people are correct. We don't have ultimate free will and self-determined a self-determined source of all of our actions, but at the same time, there is a kind of freedom.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, most definitely. And it's just like with the scientific bros, like look at like somebody like Sam Harris, who literally flat out says that there is no free will. And he gives this argument of like, just like because you can't posit like a self within like neuroscience and all that stuff. And he compares it with like Buddhism and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, he wants to hold this like neutral ground of like being able to be mindful of your own actions as a sort of freedom. And just like this, like, oh, if we just escape from the dogmatism and ignorances of religiosity, then be a better humanity that's aimed at the well-being of conscious creatures, right?
Or is like that a choice? So there's no free will, but that's a choice we can make, or we can't. Or just like a Richard self-defeating immediately.
Yeah, like a Richard Dawkins too, about like the selfish gene, right? Like we're just machines that just propagate DNA for the species, but then it's like the selfish gene, right? It's supposed to be all about like yourself. So it's just like the whole argument like begs the question: what do they mean by free will, and what do they mean by selfishness, or like conscious choice, conscious creatures and the well-being?
And I think for Lacan, because there are no objects in themselves, just like there is no thing in itself, because of that, but there is language, and language does determine who we are. Language is outside of our control, but language isn't under its own control, is the thing. So there is a kind of freedom in language. It isn't the freedom of the individual, but
what is the thing about propriety that allows for the signifier and the signified to be connected? Doesn't that also allow for some sort of like new combination of possibility? Not in like freedom par excellence of like
Exactly.
but a sort of way in we can metaphorize the scene and the horizon, I guess. You know, there's always going to be some type of phantasmatic structure that, you know, situates us in reality, not just language, but like, you know, Deleuze would call it like a virtual reality, the simulacrum for him. He wouldn't see freedom in the sense of like how he was very critical of phenomenology, but in a sense, like the difference between somebody like Deleuze versus like Hegel, Lacan, and Zizek is that Deleuze is more on this like vitalism and more of a sort of Spinozist Nietzschean, joyful, intoxicated, Baucus type spirit, like or Baucus type like ethics, right? The ethics of affirmation, yes to life, even beyond tragedy. Whereas, like, no, there's not that for Lacan, right? There's nothing affirmative, right?
Nothing can ultimately be
Right.
affirmed but
And
the dialectic in a sense.
right. And then like thinking about like Lacan was already talking about this, like he's just elaborating on it in the light of Freud, but you already know me. What are my two favorite things? Optical schema and logical time. So he talks about in logical time that man knows not what a man is except with a system of other men or in relation to other men. And he fears to be taken out of that lest he not be a man in the eyes of the others or some shit like that.
Or ladies.
Yeah, or ladies, or ladies, or they
or
them.
anybody else. No.
Yeah. But what it means to be human, right?
Yeah.
Human. Like what does it mean to be human? Everybody's gonna have a different answer because there's just this gap of certainty of what it is to be human, and just the fact that there's so many, but yet none of them seem to reach this like
Yes.
proximity of an absolute knowledge, is that it fails. And we can only relate to it with the other, even if the other doesn't know, but the other has the thing that has the possibility of my salvation.
Right. Beautifully put. Has the possibility of my salvation. I think that what Freud and Lacan do is, to the degree that they lower man, debase the human animal, they dignify the question, what does it mean to be human? They, in some ways, give the utmost dignity to the question.
Right.
The answer is always embarrassingly, cringe-inducingly
Right.
insufficient, in as much as we point to any specific human being and say, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Here's what it is. It's just a ape, a monkey that learned to talk, and oh, we're just these animals, but we just have clothes on, so we think we're so smart, and people love that as if
Right.
that's
And
some amazing insight. And
Joe
it's
Rogan
like,
bros be like, we're just apes that
just
literally
apes.
we wipe our own ass and we have to pay to live on Earth. Isn't that crazy? Like a monkey or like a bird, they're living on their own. They're one with nature. Like and like it's just this like the most like asinine like speculation ever. Like
It always goes in that direction. Why can't we just learn to get along? And if we just were more, well, if we all had millions of Spotify dollars, then we could learn to become archers too, and then be more one with nature. Anyway,
we need our own Jamie to be able to look at it like, yo, Jamie, look at why can't we just be happy? What is this Lacan dude saying?
it would be cool to have a Jamie though, just to look up certain phrases, like look up Heinameration or whatever real quick for us. All right, so getting into Hegel, air horns.
Right.
I like this. He's like, is there a lot in the same register moving from Hegel to Freud? And Hippolyte's like, yeah, a lot is, yeah, for sure.
yeah, for sure. 100%.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, no, Hippolyte, he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
When we talked to Adrian Johnson, Adrian Johnson was like, oh yeah, Hippolyte's the shit.
Yeah, no, he's definitely
Like he knows his shit. Like this dude is a Hegel scholar, but
yeah, his commentary on the phenomenology is definitely worth reading. I read that shit. I mean, I haven't finished it, but I read it when I first got it. I read like the first two chapters. It's a really great layout.
you don't tell people you didn't finish. You never tell people you didn't finish it. You just go,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's a good book.
Does
And then
anyone
you
know
wait
the
for
type
them
of
to be
book?
like, did you finish it? And then you
Yeah.
say, well, define finish.
Yeah. What it is that it was definitely compulsion to repeat. It was a failure.
I touched every page. Let's see. So where are we? The autonomous ego, the sane part of the ego. He goes back to his ego strengthening shtick. You know, he does his spiel against
Right.
uh ego strengthening. As he has already established, there is a precedent for the ego in classic philosophy, or I should say classical philosophy. It's somewhat vague when we're talking about Platonic philosophy. When we get to
Right.
Descartes, we encounter its first poignant iteration, in a sense, of the self-transparent consciousness. We've already established that self-transparent consciousness is not what we're after.
No.
But he's still asking the question, yes, is psychoanalysis
A
humanism?
humanism.
What does that have to do with Hegel exactly? That's what I wonder.
Well, the thing is, I think Hegel would still critique something of a humanism, right? Because then it puts into question like a sort of category of you know the subject in question, the human, right? How could we even posit that? And it always goes back. I mean, he even like brings it back to like the Greek. Was it Protagoras, right? Man is the measure of all things, right? But in that saying, like if man could measure, differentiation of things in the world, it's like, well, who measures him? Other men, but
Right.
the thing is, it's like,
Who measures him? Other men.
right,
Some
and
men
then
measure each other.
right.
Sorry, I had to go for
The phallus joke. You gotta love it.
measure
but
yourself. Yeah.
but the thing is, it's like well, like how could you posit a sort of measuring apparatus, like
Right.
if man is a measure, like how do we constitute man in that way?
Yep. And this is again a cutting of the Gordian knot, which is we don't need to reconstitute man as a whole.
Exactly.
In a sense, what Lacan is saying is leave him in pieces. There's a wonderful
Yeah.
Gil Scott Heron album called Pieces of a Man. It's like, no, we don't have to put all the pieces together. Leave man in if you want to get an idea, a notion of what man is that has any consequences, at least in a post-industrial age of finance capitalism, let's say, then man can only be taken in pieces. And that's the fascinating thing that, Zizek often points out, which is that psychoanalysis doesn't necessarily just isn't the science that, but the technique that discovered what man truly is. And hitherto, every other theory got it wrong. It is the technique and the theory that is uniquely equipped to address the question of, and it's an age-old question, but the answer is different now, the question of what does it mean to be human? What is the human being? Because in late stage capitalism, the answer is fundamentally a different one than that which you would get in, and Lacan points at that, like than that which you would receive in the Middle Ages or antiquity.
Right.
The object is something completely different. We are
Right.
not the same thing as what we were. That's not to say we can go access those eras and understand what man was just by reading a Platonic dialogue. But the question entails a different answer, entails a different technique.
Yeah, and like, in the fact it's like, what is it to be human or man? Like when you look at like the ideology of capitalism, which is liberalism, it's just like now it's just so robust. It's like because everybody's gonna be like, well, nobody has really the right to dictate what it means to be human, and I'm just gonna live my own life. Because the thing is just like the imperative of the liberal ideology is that you get to determine who you want to be, pretty much, right? You have the agency and freedom to do so. You have the freedom to find your own truth, your own authenticity. But it's never put into question of the groundworks in which I could deem that to be true, or like, am I really the one that really posits my own bubble of truth and freedom compared to everybody else? We could say, oh, everybody else just has their own truth, and we just need to understand that and be inclusive. But it's never on like the fact that I individually have my own truth, because I have to relate it to somebody else, right?
There are a lot of directions I could take
Yeah,
that in. This is a really great discussion, but I do want to tie it back into this. It's such a wonderful discussion of Freud as a thinker, and as I like the word he uses here, the adventure of his creation. I feel like this is a very personal sort of conversation too. But it's a great digression on what Freud is doing. And
yeah,
here's what we were saying before, though. I just was it. He says it. I won't say rationalism, but rationalization, right?
Right. And I think that is just like what we we're saying of like being able to even imminently not only just critique, but also like take in account his own things and be willing to go back, kind of like in the same way of like Zizek. It's like, oh, Zizek's always repeating the same thing. It's like, well, he's repeating it in different ways because he wants to take into account and kind of revise like a lot of what he said to kind of bring in a new path for a new understanding.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes really an original thinker.
Absolutely.
It's not that they have this own authenticity, but as a matter of fact, they are looking to go into the areas of impossibility and failure to find revision for the most part.
Yeah.
That is what is at least meant by original thinker. Right.
Absolutely.
They're dismantling a lot of mystifications of the theoretical zeitgeist of their time and how it continues to grow. And it takes people like this to really show that they're not standing outside, but rather really trying to operate and embody the zeitgeist of thinking and ideologies and show how it fails. Right.
Yeah, because most thinkers, for all their the kind of braggadocious qualities that some, well, I would say more like continental thinkers seem to have, and then the sort of reserved, withdrawn, sort of impassive, observational demeanor of Anglo-Saxon thinkers. Either way, there's a kind of timidity to most thinkers in their projects because, one, they don't want to be wrong, they don't want to be fact checked, they're concerned with peer review, citation needed,
type
shit.
Fourth, actually, Lord.
That is most of academia. That's most of the university discourse itself
Yeah.
aimed at what? Curbing enthusiasm, to quote
Yeah.
the title of a very famous. It's like, don't get too excited. Well, not in the Lacanian sense, but like, no, enthusiasm's a bad thing. Whereas it's like Freud, Lacan, and I would class Zizek with them, which might be a controversial opinion for some, and they you can call me a simp or a stan. I don't care. But the fact is, it's like here we have thinkers that, to quote the title of the latest the symposium that came out on Zizek, are willing to go to the end.
Exactly.
In that sense, where it's kind of like I will stake my entire reputation and myself as a systematician and my system on the possibility that everything that I've been speculating upon up until this point can be proved wrong by the emergence of something different and new. And I almost want to, in some death drive sense, pursue that aspect of it. This is why he's a rationalist, because in the full sense of the word, from one to the other, I tried to set that up dramatically but failed. This text, so difficult to penetrate, around which we have been turning, makes present the most lively, the most pressing demands of a reason which never abdicates, which does not say, here begins the opaque and the ineffable. That's the cop out.
Right.
He enters, and even at the risk of appearing lost in obscurity, he continues with reason. This is why Zizek even says about Lacan, I thought I was really surprised in Sublime Object when he says that, like, Lacan actually represents the culmination of the Enlightenment tradition, in terms of a pursuit of reason.
Right.
This is the pursuit of reason. It's not, oh well, science took that over and
No, they didn't.
ran with it.
Yeah.
No, science is predicated on a spiritualism of its own kind. But
exactly. And even now you could see like the way scientism will like, it's not even just like a sort of like, well, science doesn't know everything today, but tomorrow it will know more. Even in its paradoxical like contradictions, like for instance, the way of like the whole double slit experiment of like, oh, you know, when we didn't put the measure device on, but when we freaking observed it with our eyes, we see how it acts as a photon particle rather than a wave. It leads into a paradox rather than contradiction. So it's like you can't really, unless you're like a dialectician or a systematician, to be able to work through those paradoxes towards a level of contradiction, you're just stuck in this like paradox where it's just like, well, is there something of a power of the mind to where it really controls our reality, and it leads to this mystification of sort of subjectivism and like other spiritualisms on the outside, or even religiosity, right? Where science doesn't want to touch the deadlocks lest it's at least lest it like lets go of its throne of mastery, will try to evoke some type of religious ideal. Does God really exist? The whole thing of like, oh, there are numbers in the universe in binary code. Is there an intelligent design type shit? Like,
right, because that's the thing. Yeah, because as Zizek often points out, when you pursue something to a certain extreme, it ultimately coincides with its opposite. The set contains a particular which aligns with the universal, but as its opposite, the same happens with scientism, right, where the straw manning of the scientists is the fact, this idea, oh, they hate all spirituality. This is what I was saying before, not to repeat myself, but they leave no room for the unknown, the mysterious, the ineffable, blah, blah, blah. When most do reach that point, and what happens is there is this flirting with the opposite of the thing that has been eschewed thus far within their system, which would be God, which would be spiritual. And then it takes on a kind of Hollywood cheap, like Netflix movie narrative of like the, hardline, inveterate atheist materialist who has a sudden spiritual awakening. It's like more often than not, most people think in those terms, and then there's like maybe a Neil deGrasse Tyson who doesn't, but that
Yeah.
they're the exception. The like these this idea of like this thoroughgoing materialist who doesn't leave any room for chance or the mysterious or the inexplicable is also a kind of trope. The thing is, what we're dealing with here is neither one nor the other, but
Right.
a third thing that is very different. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that when you get to that point of reaching that which we cannot speak upon, believe me, something is spoken there. There is no pure silence. There's no such thing. When you get to a point where you're like, well, here we need to recognize a confine, a boundary, a border, and beyond it is the thing in itself. Like, believe me, the thing in itself is defined in no uncertain terms as a something. It's never something completely neutral. Is the idea. So that's where ideology comes in. It's on the margins where you're like, well, this is something beyond everybody.
Yeah.
It has a certain tang to it that that's where control and
Right.
ideology really come in.
Exactly. And like to like kind of like reach out to the audience, like it seems like we're going on a tangent, but this what we're doing actually ties in with what the title is talking about, right? Freud, Hegel, and the machine. What is the machine? It's the symbolic order, language, but also situates a lot of things, the mystification of ideology, right? Etc. Like, and even the whole science delusions or philosophical delusions that want to maintain this predication of a certain way of thinking, and not willing to go further into the deadlocks when it leads to paradoxes. This is exactly what Hegel and Freud have witnessed in their imminent critiques, and were willing to go through and beyond those failures and to sublate them. What I was mentioning earlier about it's literally the title is going beyond the pleasure principle, or beyond the pleasure principle, right? Because there is a sort of dependence on the pleasure principle and the reality principle, and on homeostasis versus entropy, and on restitution and repetition. And Freud is realizing that we need to really investigate the failures of either or within this death drive, just like Hegel is trying to go beyond the antinomies of Kant in empiricism and in
Yes.
rationalism, right?
I really like how you put that, trying to go beyond the antinomies of Kant, but Kant's discovery of those antinomies was definitely revolutionary in its own right.
Right.
It's just that Hegel repositions the
Exactly.
place of the place of the antinomy and the way antinomies are, how would I put it, imminent within the thing itself. But I just want to say, yeah, I feel like what we're saying might seem very tangential at this point, but I feel like, no, I think it's actually right in line with
Right.
what is going on here.
What Lacan is trying to do is give theoretical groundwork and merit to this controversial concept, the death instinct, because you could see in the audience there's a lot of speculation, a lot of doubt, especially
Woolly philosophy, I think, is
yeah,
what Manoni or Hippolyte says like, oh, well, there's a lot of woolly philosophy
Right.
going on here. And that is expressive of the general reception of the concept of death drive
Right.
within the psychoanalytic community at the time and to this day. Like, but it even as recent as reading Jouissance by Darian Leader, he dismissed the drive. I don't. There's a paper out there somewhere where he criticizes the concept of the drive, but it wasn't a popular concept at the time. And I think it's only with Lacan that death drive gets restitution, so to
Right.
speak. But
And this is, I think, also important for anybody, any future Lacanian scholars. A prolegomena to any future Lacanian,
yes,
any
that's
Freudian,
fire.
is understanding the groundworks and possibility of what constitutes death drive, because they kind of take this at face value. It's like, oh, the drive, the death drive, but it's like, well, what made this concept so controversial or groundbreaking, and what is it that really has a sort of placeholder on a subject that tries to take itself into account, and also an ego that tries to resist the unconscious, right? The function of the death drive, its nature, pretty much. And I think this is exactly, like, to repeat what I said, it's like Lacan is trying to give a theoretical framework for this, and really shed the light the investigation that Freud was trying to do.
Absolutely, and as Coutron says, it's a meta commentary on Freud, and nothing more than that.
Catron Sims.
It is a meta commentary on Freud, but it's not just that.
Yeah.
I like this part. He's like, "Don't take me as your adversary. I'm not Hegelian.
Yeah.
I'm probably against." He's like, "I'm probably against Hegel, honestly."
That's
like,
a whole commentary on him.
I'm like honestly, like, yeah, I wrote a whole commentary on him, but I'm probably against him at the end of the day.
Like
It's like Hippolyte, like, I'm sorry, buddy, but like you're only gonna be remembered as a Hegelian, buddy.
Yeah.
Like I can't help you there. Like
what was that? Was it is it the Amanda show, or is it all that has totally Kyle? It's just Hippolyte, he's totally Hegel.
I don't know totally, Kyle.
He's just like this hippie kid.
He's like, yo, I don't rep, don't take me as representing Hegel. I don't rep Hegel. It's like shit, you don't rep Hegel,
Yeah.
Hippolyte. Come on.
Seminar 1, he was talking all Hegel.
Yeah, what happened? Like seminar 1, you were talking all this Hegel. He's like, well, that was homework. That was an underappreciated meme also that I made. With the puppet, like looking back, the puppet with the eyes, like,
oh yeah.
It's like that was him talking about Verneinung.
Right. Yeah, I remember that one. That's a good one.
Lacan's like, all right, fine, guy, but you're more of a Hegel specialist than I. So
yeah, than any of us in the room. So
like, can you just stop being coy and tell us about Hegel?
Yeah.
So, but I really like what he asks here, which is, one can ask whether there is a moment in the wake of experience which appears as absolute knowledge, or whether absolute knowledge is in the whole presentation of experience. Right. Great question. Like, is there a moment? When you think moment, you think logical time, in a sense, or are we already there?
Yeah. And I think the way I understand it is like, was it in like the first seminar where he says that, like, it's always like the speculation of like, oh, everything's all there in the first instance of the transference, right? It's like, no, it's each time that there's compulsion to repeat, like you learn something new. It's like, no, and then like then you realize, oh, everything was already there to begin with when the transference first started. I think that kind of applies too, because what's important about the transference and like the death drive and all this, it's like the being able to construct the history of the subject, right? To not an absolute knowledge like what was talked about in like the very first two chapters of the seminar of like the Meno, rather than talking about a Platonic knowledge of like of absolute truth, we're talking about like a more particular truth of the subject. But was the truth already there from the get-go, or is it something that like we're aiming towards, like almost towards like the end of history and like this crude understanding of Hegel? Or is it like in each moment it was there? No, it's now. No, now it's now.
Well, what he says is absolute knowledge would be experienced as such and not a moment in experience. For Hegel, I don't know if this is relevant, but having just read the first chapter of For They Know Not What They Do,
Banger.
again, what?
Banger.
Banger. One of the best things Zizek's ever written. He says his critique of Derrida's interpretation of Hegel is that when the universal encounters its opposite, it isn't just a moment among moments. It isn't a particular among particulars that make up the set that constitutes the universal or that is subsumed under the universal, but rather the particular that is its opposite is actually the particularization that gives meaning and truth and form to the universal itself. So in this sense, there is not a specific moment in experience to which all other moments are subordinated,
Right.
but absolute knowledge, which must be gained through experience, would give meaning to the form of experience as such.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, that makes sense.
And it's embodied in the discourse.
Yes.
What
yeah.
is it? What is, I couldn't tell you offhand, though, what anything I'm saying has to do with psychoanalysis, though.
Well, I guess everything is in the discourse itself, and like psychoanalysis takes itself in account as a discourse, right? It's not a meta language, right? And I think there is still some sort of like, and this is why, like, even though as far as clinically there's no philosophy into it, you're not doing philosophy to your patient. You're not even using jargon in the way that analysts understand the jargon of psychoanalysis in relation to other analysts, in the academic sense of creating the model, because that could alienate somebody's symptom. Even worse, not everybody comes from the same academic or background or understanding or anything like that. You may be dealing with a neurotic or psychotic from a working class background, just like you may be dealing with a neurotic from a middle class background that like has some knowledge of Freud, like the Wolfman, right? But to that degree, it just depends on what you're doing. But at the same time, the more that you work with different patients, like different particulars, the more that you could somehow posit some sort of aim at a universality of subject and substance. And I think that's why, like, going back to the preface of Sublime Logic Ideology, the fact that psychoanalysis and the Hegelian dialectic reconcile each other, because they do aim at this point of understanding of the interplay of the universality and the particular, and how was it like psychoanalysis always situates itself on what fails. It locates itself in failure.
Yes.
Just like Hegel does.
Exactly. Right? And that is also why it is a necessary form of discourse in this modern era, when everything we do is geared towards what works, what should work better, what's going to be successful, what can be achieved. Whereas if you think about the history of at least Western thought, Western philosophy, I hesitate to say what. I know Western is a loaded sort of concept, and
yeah, because when you get into the degrees, even like Middle Eastern philosophy is considered a Western in a sense, like somebody like Avicenna and all that stuff, right? But that's
yeah, just for the sake of convenience, because I'm not trying to get into the whole thing about like, oh, the West is best or nothing like that. Of course not, but at least in terms of Christendom, anything that falls under that title and within that realm of thought, it's like you have this idea of the fall, which is a kind of a fetishism that modern people think they've gotten beyond. And I don't want to make an argument for like, oh, well, that's why it's a good concept and we need to get back to like
Yeah.
accepting
Back to
sin as part of our
orthodoxy.
lives. But no, not that at all. I'm only bringing up the fall and the idea that there is something to be said about the fact that a kind of a failure to do something was constitutive of a kind of experience of oneself and identity.
Right.
Whereas the modern subject is anti-failure, which sounds kind of counterintuitive to say anti-failure, but psychoanalysis reintroduces failure into a structure that's bent on phallic sublation of all things.
Yeah.
To achieve what exactly nobody knows. That's the thing. Hegel, though, understands the value of failure because his is the failed absolute, to quote part of Zizek's one book. I think people don't understand that about Hegel, right? Because maybe it's his vocabulary, maybe it's the grandiosity of the way he writes in a sense that would suggest a kind of success and closure and completion, but it really is the failure that animates his system. And it's the same with psychoanalysis. It's the failure.
Most definitely.
In psychoanalysis, and Zizek says psychoanalysis itself is a failure. I was listening to the Zizek and so on interview, their first interview with him last night. Shout out to Michael from Zizek and so on. That's the homie.
Homie Michael, our favorite Aussie.
Our favorite Aussie. But they were like Zizek was saying how because the question is, what is psychoanalytic theory as opposed to the technique, right? Theory. This seminar itself has that in the title. Well, it's like the theory itself is an explanation of the failure of psychoanalysis too.
Yeah.
Because psychoanalysis, while it's very useful, while I would say we're both adherents of it and believe in its efficacy, is also a kind of failure.
Yeah.
Because it only exists to address an individual, well, and let's be honest, generally speaking, a bourgeois individual in late stage capitalism.
Right. Well, I think also too that, and the reason why psychoanalysis could fail too is the fact of always adhering to the discourse of the analyst, which is the discourse of resigning mastery, like no mastery at all. The analyst doesn't have any mastery. And so to take on that role, you're also put into the burden of embracing failure with somebody that is coming to you that believes that you have this knowledge, right? That is going to help them desire like they used to desire. And the demands and frustrations that come when you don't give into an obsessive, or whatever. Especially if you're not the master, then how are you going to posit yourself in a psychotic who is non-duped, right? Who has the foreclosure, or somebody who is perverse and wants to be into this scopic drive of fucking you with the gaze, as Derek Cook says, and putting you in this sort of sadomasochism relationship in the transference that could evoke a sort of enjoyment and perversion within you. So there is this failure in that too, because it's like, how do some people react? Well, there's also the paranoia. If the ego has a core of paranoia, then there's also this sort of paranoia that can be invoked in the analyst in the countertransference that they have to be wary of, because then it leads to something that's like, oh, I failed because I'm not the master. You never were the master to begin with. That's the point of being an analyst, right?
Yeah. And it's funny. I don't know why this came to me. I don't know if this is relevant, but there's a kind of interpolation in the perverse gaze too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The analyst is also interpolated
Mm-hmm.
in what the analysand does, hence the possibility of countertransference. But
Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect.
completed discourse, right? The embodiment of absolute knowledge is the instrument of power, the scepter, the property
Right.
of those who know. I love this example he uses here. When the scientists I mentioned yesterday evening, this is more than a myth, it is the very meaning of the forward march of the symbol, succeed in bringing human discourse to a close, they are in possession of it. And those who don't have it have nothing left but to turn to jazz, to dance, to entertain themselves. The good fellows, the
Yeah.
nice guys, the libidinal types.
It's so funny.
I'm just thinking also of France at the time, and they were, of all
Right.
the European countries, the most jazz crazed and loved that kind of culture. So he must have been contrasting the nerds that he was dealing with the libertine culture
Exactly.
of France at the time. Well, this is post-war, right? This is 1954. Here, 9 years after the end
Right.
of the war. But he brings this up again. He- he- who who's the master here? If they're having fun and they have no need of your knowledge, are you the master? But then there are moments when even the jazz cats will be frustrated by the fact that the other side has the knowledge they can't access. That might not be the right reading, but I don't know. What did you make of this?
Well, I think it's just like, well, like if we're enjoying, but like the thing is like there has to be a master even in these jazz cats, because it's like what permits it to be enjoyable rather than prohibiting it. Does that make sense?
What permits it to be enjoyable?
Yeah. Who gives it permissible, right? Who gives you permission to enjoy the jazz and be like this rather than be like, oh, I don't believe in the master of science or politics, just live life. Like it seems like they're just like doing what we're doing now of like, oh, just like eat, pray, love type stuff, right?
That's a really good point though, because it's like you still need permission. You're getting permission
Right.
from some source of authority, whether you acknowledge it or not. Although you indulge
Right.
with the thought that this is spontaneous.
Because when we're talking about knowledge, right, and mastery, the point is that the master has knowledge and you hysterize it or want it, not because you want to know something, but because it gives you some sort of like closer proximity to enjoy, right?
Yeah.
There's an element of enjoyment in this objet of knowledge.
Yes.
Right? Behind that gate, right? And so I think that's probably why he's mentioning this.
I like what he says here. Hegel is at the limit of anthropology. Freud got out of it. His discovery is that man isn't entirely in man. And Freud is not a humanist. So
I will explain to you why.
the question,
I'll try.
um,
I think this is interesting right here when he says that Freud was a physician, but not like somebody like Asclepius, Hippocrates, or Saint Luke, right? They all have their own things. I'm not really too familiar with Asclepius. I just know Hippocrates more, or like I don't even really know much of like Saint Luke. I don't know if you know any of those two. But I know Hippocrates like came up with the Hippocratic oath, and of course he was,
Asclepius is the one who came up with, well, he was like the god of medicine, I think. And
oh, okay,
there's
okay.
the entangled snakes
The
that's called
Caduceus.
the I believe it's called like the rod of Asclepius
Oh
that you
yeah,
find in,
like the
right?
Caduceus, right?
What's it called?
The Caduceus.
Oh, is that what it's called?
Yeah,
I also
the
know it as like the rod of Asclepius, I
yeah.
think.
Well, maybe that is, and like Caduceus is more like along the lines of like what Mercury holds, Hermes and Mercury.
But the snakes
Yeah,
that are
yeah, and the
intertwined.
rod and the wings up top. Yeah, it's called the Caduceus. And but like I think what's interesting is that with Freud, right, it's a position not so much on like with a certain type of a thing far different from the body, right? And like these sort of like if you look at like these sort of physicians, it's like these each organ or bile or blood, whatever, has a certain temperament to it or correspondence. With him, he's not really worried about that. In fact, like with his diagnosis of like neurosis and hysteria, obsessional, it's like especially with hysteria, um, there is this convergence of like, oh, certain somatic symptoms that happen onto the body with no physical cause, right? And so that's what leads into the inquiry of like the talking cure with Anna O and like things like hypnotism and the dream work, which it's like to go beyond the body, but not to like where he says like fall into the idiocy of like Descartes and trying to like, separate the mind and the body only to unite them back again in this weird way. What he's doing is seeing like sort of other type of investigation, right, through speech, through language, right, into the unconscious, and how something of like what he'll say, what Lacan will talk about in Seminar One about the pathogenic nucleus.
But do you think though that maybe we are here audience to a more optimistic Lacan than what we'd find later on, because maybe he does believe in something like a reconstitution of the individual, not in a Cartesian sense, but at this stage,
Oh,
it
Freud
becomes more
or Lacan?
well, Lacan, I would say.
Um,
That's what I wonder. Like, what's his understanding of the cure, or if there is a
yeah,
cure at this
well,
point?
yeah, that's a good question because I mean, like in Seminar One, it's like what is it that psychoanalysis does, right?
I
Um,
don't know yet. I
yeah,
don't know exactly what he thinks it does yet.
yeah, that was always like what was put into question. That's why like he was investigating the Freudian papers on technique. I still am wondering what Lacan thinks, and I think it's more developmental throughout his entire seminars because we should know that he wasn't a psychoanalyst his whole life. He started off as a psychiatrist, right?
Right.
Yeah, that was the main thing. Which is totally different from like Freud. Like when he started psychoanalysis, he wasn't a psychologist, or he was a physician, a neurologist. Um, and
Keep talking. I'm gonna hit
I
the
think
head, as you say.
yeah, and like it's just interesting because as I was saying that Lacan is saying that Freud is a physician, but far different than the three mentioned because he wasn't aimed at healing the body or these certain virtues or temperaments, of like, oh, you're angry or you have a lot of hate in your soul, your blood is too hot, or you're sad, you're melancholic, you have too much bile in you type thing. So here, take these herbs or do this and that. Freud was on another level that I wouldn't say transcends the body, but something that there really is no physical cause for, especially with people like hysterics. That with hysteria, some of the symptoms could be a sort of hypochondria where they're always obsessive of whether or not they're physically sick. And sometimes they develop illnesses that have no physical cause to it. Most obsessional people, hysterics, end up also being the ones that are like always getting the cold. Why am I always getting sick? Why am I always like, it's not flu season and they end up with a fever, or they end up with like migraines or a headache. They're always complaining about not feeling well. and these sort of like obsessional wonderings, like what's the root of it all, which is also part of hysteria. And I think with the work that Freud was doing in the early workings of psychoanalysis with Breuer and Anna O led to his further investigation of something deeper than just like his physiology and being like a traditional physician, noticing from the failures of hypnosis that there's something that is resisting. The pathogenic nucleus is what is resisting, and it's not the level of dream interpretation and free association of the talking cure that we get to understand the ideation of this pathogenic nucleus, and something bigger in the symptom than just these clusters of symptoms on a psychosomatic level. And that is, in the unconscious. And it comes out within the slips of the tongues, forgetting of names, all these different parapraxis, which Lacan will just call like when empty speech fails, full speech arises, right? Biao hum. And all these aren't on this level of like understanding of the body, not just like in, ancient Greece, but even now.
I love what he says here. It is very odd to say. There's a truly strange incoherence in saying man has a body.
Yeah. Right. We have a body, because in this like, well, if the body is the object of possession, then who's the possessor?
It's like what does Carl Pilkington say? Am I in charge of me brain, or is my brain in charge of me?
Right.
I always loved in The Simpsons also where Homer would be talking to his brain and his brain would be like, all right, I'm going home. I'm like, I'm done. And it's just like, well, but who's Homer then?
Exactly right.
Right? If he's not, if his brain considers Homer stupid, too
Yeah.
stupid for him, then who is his brain and who's Homer exactly?
Yeah.
Um,
It's definitely like again, by like having this type of dualistic thinking, you end up in the paradoxes and contradictions. And meanwhile, analytic philosophy still wants to have philosophy of mind and talk about psychic causality or mental causation versus physical causation. It's just so freaking, oh God, I can't stand it.
if there's one thing that's true about analytic philosophy is they don't know what they want.
Yeah, they don't know what they want,
The
right?
thing is, the kind of theory that we're into takes seriously the fact that no one knows what they want,
Right.
whereas they analytic philosophy obviously doesn't know what it wants,
Yeah.
but doesn't take seriously that fact.
Right.
But I love how he says it is very strange to be localized in a body. This strangeness can't be minimized. This is where I think phenomenology comes into it. I also like how he says it, what that idiot Descartes had cut into two,
Yeah.
with some irony. I think he says that, but it's strange enough to be in a body before you need to reconstitute the
Right.
human as one. It's like philosophy really, most philosophers really jump the gun in not taking seriously what's strange about what's given from the outset and trying to build towards something beyond that. But we're already in a kind of philosophical predicament the moment we even acknowledge ourselves as being located in a body.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's definitely, and like again, like it comes with the failures of trying to posit a sort of identity, right? Because it can only reflect on, again, it goes back to Hegel. A does not equal A.
Yes.
any type of positing of something like mind body is an identity, and it can only contrast itself upon something that seems to be its antithesis. But the point of Hegel is to show that both antithesis and a thesis, or a thesis and antithesis, aren't full external things, that they all have their internal contradictions, right? Of a sort of abstract negative universality versus a concrete particular. And this is like exactly the whole thing about like sublation and suspending the sort of positing of a self-determination of an identity.
Well, for Zizek, A equals A contains the moment of suspension where subject is introduced. You anticipate the attachment of a predicate to that subject, but what you get instead is the exact same thing, but it can't be the same thing. So your mind already goes to what that other A is, which is whenever you say, I think the example uses like
Yeah, because
God is God or law is law.
right.
Everybody understands what that means
Right.
right away.
Right.
How is that though? Because it's just the predicate is the same as the subject
Exactly.
on
Right.
semantically, but
Right.
it's not, because you immediately understand that the what's seemingly just a tautology
Exactly.
contains something else. The second, the
Right. And
the
it's
the
like,
other law is obviously law, like the first law is obviously the good law, the right law, the righteous law, and the second law is like, oh well, you want to see law, I'll show you law.
right. But and it's like funny because it's like it's very like tautological. It's just saying it's like almost like when Kant is trying to talk about like an analytic judgment or understanding of something. Like for instance, when he says like the term bachelor already contains itself within its definition.
Where all bachelors are unmarried men,
Unmarried,
right?
right? You know, and that's like very tautological or redundant, right? Because it's already given within its name.
Well, Kant's whole thing is, of course, that taking a page from Leibniz's book that philosophy should, and he's getting this from Descartes, aspire to an apodictic state or an apodictic truth that approximates or, in some sense, essentializes the truth of mathematics, which is apodictically true. It's irresistibly true. And then, so the only kind of truth for, based on that definition of truth that would have, or any kind of theorem that would mean anything, would be one that's um obeys the principle of non-contradiction.
Right.
So
Back to Aristotle.
all the way back to Aristotle, Kant's the first person to address the synthetic a priori, and that like, well, how can things be true that don't that aren't also tautological? And I was just reading this in Karatani where it's like people don't understand what he has to say about mathematics, because people, a lot of thinkers, most philosophers of science and mathematics immediately dismiss Kant for his statement that mathematics is synthetic a priori, because they're convinced that mathematics is analytic.
Yeah.
And actually, no, like the brilliant insight that Kant made is that it is synthetic a priori, and that there's a there's a truth to it which isn't completely arbitrary. But the
Right.
thing is, all these mathematical systems cannot be themselves together systematized and based in
Oh yeah,
one, grounded in one totalizing metaphysical system of mathematics. That's the difference. That's what he introduced as what I was just reading this, and I think Wittgenstein agrees with him in that all of these different mathematical systems have family, what he calls family resemblances, but that doesn't mean that there is a metaphysical ground. That
right.
mathematics doesn't mean anything. Geometry might mean something a little bit more than mathematics does. Arithmetic, maybe a little bit more, but mathematics as a whole, geometry and arithmetic, they intersect at points. They have mutually entailed consequences, but that does not mean there's any totalizable foundation for
Yeah.
all of these systems. That doesn't imply that. You don't need, you can have axioms without grounding those axioms in one metaphysic. And
Right.
what's disavowed by, uh, again, scientific thinkers is the idea it's like there is a metaphysic that you are relying on in trying to create these systems. I feel like we've gotten far afield of like what we're talking about here, but it does relate to this of here, like this gestaltism, right? This gestaltism that Lacan is talking about is an embedded and oftentimes disavowed metaphysic that
Right. Yeah.
underlies the thinking of different philosophers. And, well, Descartes introduces something very important, but he also he's not Freud in that,
No.
again, like we always say, he wants to reconstitute man as is something that you know, in trying to reconcile the two halves that he's introduced, he relies on a kind of gestaltism that wants mathematics and philosophy and any axiomatization of the human individual of consciousness to ultimately aspire to the status of an analytic statement, of having that kind of truth, because it's already assumed that mathematics is analytic in
Yeah.
nature and has always been assumed. That is actually one of Kant's truly Copernican turning points,
That's true.
is in questioning the status of mathematics in that, right? So here we have this metaphor of the clock, which is, I feel like we've talked about this before, right? Like
Right. Right. Yeah.
man
Yeah.
as clock, you know, this deistic idea of
Yes.
we wind the clock, it operates on its own. It is the ultimate, and whether we realize it or not, I think we're often relying on this image of the clock and the inner workings of the clock to stand for meta, like, or not, what's the phrase, I think it's like antonomasia of like the of being the par excellence
Right.
um metaphor image of machines as a whole,
Yeah.
because seemingly the clock, even you have to wind it, of course,
You
but
do. Yeah.
seemingly like it operates on its own,
Exactly.
right? It seems to be in perpetual motion.
Right. Yeah. And like what I've said before about like with the watch machine versus like machines is what he's going to be talking about like shortly in this chapter. It's like with a watchmaker, all you just need is, just again, or with a watch, you just need a watchmaker, and the watch runs on its own. It doesn't need somebody to watch it, right? for it to work. But as he gets on further about like Freud's understanding of energy, right? It's that like energy, yeah, of course it already existed, but it didn't exist in the sense as it does now with machines like the steam engine. That's something that Hegel didn't account for apparently in Lacan's eyes, because Hegel didn't have the notion of energy within his works. But like energy in like propulsion, hydraulics, yeah, all these, exist as potential, but they could only exist as potential retroactively so far as we have equations for these things within that framework of machinic operations with the steam engine, with the trains and airplanes and hydraulic systems, and therefore energy is now quantifiable versus it's like what does he say in the next page about like the price of food,
Yeah.
this in equations because of like this having slaves. There was no understanding of energy. If it was no, a
Yeah.
slave could freaking get old and die, but that
That's
was just part of like the entire thing that they thought, oh, that's just part of the slave, not in the fact that there's something called energy that is quantifiable in equation and how it expands and contracts.
no, that's so interesting because it's like really what you're talking about is the relation between different parts of a machine.
Right.
And this is kind of related to what I was saying before about mathematics. It's like each machine represents contains interrelations of its parts. And
Right.
then in order to understand those interrelations, you need to posit something like energy. And then you take energy as something that exists in and of itself and as the aim and purpose of the machine to generate the energy. But this is exactly what we were talking about before with the first is subject, then is substance, the positing of its presuppositions, where it's like energy you could see as a subject in
Yeah.
a sense, because
Yeah.
it's like you have these interrelations of different parts, and then to explain them, you need a provisional concept of energy. But
Yeah.
then you take energy as existing prior to the the parts of the machine, and then as in some sense, then the generation of energy becomes the end of the machine itself.
Right. Right.
And
Like the whole thing
like
about potential and kinetic energy, right? In physics.
right,
Because
which I've never totally understood the distinction there, but it's
yeah, potential could only exist retroactively so far as that energy now exists in a sort of quantifiable mathematical way, and it could be posited the fact because machines require some energy, mechanical energy. And it even gets a little more nuanced when we talk about electrical energy because of the magnetic field and the rotation and conduction of relative forces, right? And when we talk about generation of electrical power, it requires mechanical energy to move in a certain way that it creates a certain magnetic field and friction and conduction induction for that thing, to create electrical charge. But there's this whole thing about this potentiality of electricity, but it's like that can only be posited retroactively from the position of how electrical energy could function.
and
And
that's what
so
yeah.
ways that you could just like not only quantitative but qualitative, how energy mechanical is qualitative, or yeah, qualitative, electrical, signal, right?
And it's Chiesa who quotes Lacan in this regard. I don't know where Lacan says this in which seminar, but this idea of the sprite of the river. When you think of a river in motion,
Mm.
the stream of water, you think of it as impelled by a certain force, and that force has like a certain origin, and that becomes the sprite of the river. And I remember in the Not To, Chiesa talks about this when he's exposing the inherent disavowed animism within modern scientific theories of energy and movement and motion, physics in general, because there's always a sprite of the river.
Right. No, yeah, no, I understand that.
Dirty sprite.
Dirty Sprite. Yep. Sorry, there was a drought.
The dirty sprite of the river.
Future, man. Future is the Lacanian.
We are not clocks.
Yeah.
I like how Lacan's always saying like you should read. Oh, Lacan was like the original hipster because he's like, oh, I like. He's always talking about some B-side or some like deep cut of Descartes. He's like, oh, you motherfuckers are reading like Discourse on Method, but I bet you've never read Of Man.
Yeah.
And he does the same thing in the next chapter where he's like, y'all need to read Repetition by Kierkegaard.
Right?
Like you probably never heard of it.
Yeah,
It's like
I'm sure you read
it's
Six
pretty
Fucking
obscure.
Dead.
Like you should really check that out. Yeah, you can get it for cheap.
But
Yeah,
don't beg your university to get it for you.
I don't know. Like you probably find it somewhere. There's a good translation. You might be able to
like
get it.
the chick that you made the meme of for Socrates, like, yeah.
Yeah.
That's for doing those hipster impressions.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing I always like, he keeps saying, like, please read Freud. Like, have you even read Freud? It's like, do you even live, bro? Kind of thing. Like, he's just like, have you read Freud?
Yes.
He keeps saying, like, read, like, have you read the Beyond the Pleasure Principle? Like, have you read this? It's like, yeah, you're stop being so sassy.
Yeah, he's a hipster.
He's such a fucking hipster, man.
Probably rolls his eyes like and closes it. Like, what I like about like Freud though, like
he was the original hipster. He just like he like thrifting and antiques and shit like that.
God damn, that's funny.
I don't know. Maybe we haven't talked enough about the machine. We only have 2 pages left.
Right, and like what I want to go back to the machine too is the fact that like, and I want.
What are we missing here?
Well, the one thing I want to reiterate about like what I said about like the machine is the fact of like that there needs to be somebody to keep an eye on it too. Whereas, you didn't have to keep an eye on a watch. You don't have to watch a watch. You have to watch a machine because they break down, right? And it's different from just tuning a watch. They break down, and it's like, well, the symbolic order breaks down in the subject as well. And I think, I don't know how he's going with this metaphor, but you see, it's like the analyst watching the machine of the unconscious, right? The machine of unconscious. Shout out to the podcast, but the machine as a symbolic order as it breaks down because of the real, and where you watch the compulsion to repeat. Therefore, is where like to continue on with this like metaphor. It's like the technician of troubleshooting why the machine broke down, and where the location of the fault is for the breakdown. That is, I think, trying to take that metaphor to its limits of like how he's trying to.
Where it breaks down, and here's where Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus introduce a very like rich kind of vocabulary for what he's talking about here in these like disjunctive and conjunctive syntheses, because it's sort of, don't they also say it's like the machine is not defined by what it produces, it's not defined by how well it works, it really is defined ultimately by its breakdowns. And that's also what relates one machine to another, because machines don't exist in isolation.
Right.
Machines, there's a constellation of machines out there. They depend on each other, but they depend on each other so much so that it's sort of like where one machine breaks down, another machine intervenes to, well, not even correct it. I think this is why I like, what I like the most in D&G is this idea of machines that it's not this idea of capitalist efficiency. We're getting better. We're making machines work
Yeah.
better with other machines. It's like the generation, the production of other machines is dependent on where one machine breaks down, and it's a series of contingent failures.
Mhm.
Also, for Deleuze and Guattari, I think of like that's what makes machines. They're
Right.
defined by their failures, not by what they produce, not by where they're successful.
Yeah.
I
Definitely.
I think that's what he's saying.
Right. And it's just like, even though we come up to like different stuff, like we have like now, like as far as like when it comes to transportation, the biggest thing that we have is like electrically powered, like I don't know, like rail lines, or like Tesla cars, right? That run on electricity. But it doesn't defeat the fact that there's still like steam powered things. Like even in the military, some of the ships are steam powered. There's still like old ships that use steam powered. But then you got like, it's like, even though we know those break down, there's still like this efficiency of using that in the midst of like this quote unquote progressing. Whereas it's like, no, it's more assembly.
Right.
I'm too Deleuzian about it, but I think it still ties in the fact it's like, even though like there's a breakdown in the machine and it leads to like a new contingency for like a new type of like machinic structure, it doesn't truly get rid of the old.
Yeah, and nor does like the new machine necessarily address an inefficiency in another machine. The whole idea of the, let's say, the creative power, the creative function of speech is that, yes, where the machine breaks down, it opens a field, it creates the site for the, let's say, like installation, in the the place where a new machine can take hold. But that's, you would think like, well, the new machine's going to address the inefficiencies in the old machine. No, not necessarily. There's just a space opened up where something else fills in. And then later you would think, well, this is an improvement on this machine. We have this introduction, this innovation of this machine, but it only, and then we're going to get into this in the next chapter. It only seems that way in retrospect, where everything takes on the quality of a specific teleological narrative, where it's like, well, there was this machine, and then there was this machine, there was steam, and that, like, see what it did for us. And where no, it's like a series of mm, contingent deformations, I would almost say, that take the appearance of something that needed to exist.
Yeah.
That is what ultimately drives the development of technology.
Yeah.
There is a creativity to it
Yeah.
that has nothing to do with efficiency.
And to get back on this text, right? Why is energy important, or why this machine? It's not just the fact that we're talking about, like with Lacan, like, yeah, the symbolic order is like a machine that takes a life on its own, but still needs to be watched. It's the fact that Freud, and it's back to this term that I was trying to mention in the beginning of this, like antiphrasis of like using a word ironically than what it's like posited to be, right? Biology for Freud is not the biology that we are used to talking about life and talking about. The unit of life is a cell. We're not talking about the mitochondria. We're not talking about any of this. Biology is energy for Freud, and it is energy in the way that it moves in the circuit of, the organism, and how we could look at, we'll say that the brain is both a censorship of the energy in a sense, but it's also a dream machine, as he says, producing dreams for the subject, and this is showing like how for Freud and the organism, right, there is this regulation of energy from homeostasis and insistency from the entropy and trying to find pleasure, but it ultimately fails. It breaks down. Why does it break down? Death instinct. Because it can never fully get to comfortability from old habits. or from a reconstitution of itself towards a positive manner.
Yeah, and what is creativity but destruction?
Yeah.
Ultimately, what's true creativity?
Yeah.
Because if there was any need to, like the whole idea is, it's like basic bitch economists will be like, well, their needs and
Well, there
needs
are
need to
needs.
be addressed and filled, and then that leads to other, and
Right. There are needs. Some people like to go grocery shopping. Other
yeah.
people want to go to the drive-through McDonald's, and it's just everybody has their. Some people like to drive Subarus. Other people are just
Yeah, yeah,
Pumas.
yeah.
Like,
And
the thing
it's
about the free market and the visible hand, right? Like,
and then when it comes to like our decadent, like the decadence of our society, it'll just be like, whoa, people are like their instant gratification, and that's why we have so much pollution and this ecological crisis. But if people were able to content themselves with less, then we wouldn't have this. But they're missing the whole point, that the whole idea is that what we're talking about with machines and the creative function of speech is that it continues to, in a sense, create these monstrosities, these like perverted.
yeah, monstructions. That's a good. That's a good.
Ooh,
That's a good. What is it? For like kind of like familiar and all that stuff.
I
That's a.
like that, monstructions. That's what it is. Yeah, monstruction, because these are like monstrosities in the sense that ultimately they can be made to serve a purpose, but taken as a whole, they serve no purpose. I can see the skyline of my city from my balcony, and I'm always like, well, what's the point of this? Like, what's the point of
Right.
there is no point there. It's ultimately a machine, and it's a pointless monstrosity.
Or like, what's the point of like, oh, you live in a peaceful neighborhood and like you still have like a Karen that wants to have a neighborhood watch. A neighborhood watch for what? I thought you lived in this area because it's peaceful.
Well, I want to keep it peaceful, is what you say, right?
And then be causing the most drama for no reason.
And then, but there you go. It's like you create trouble for yourself, you create problems for yourself, or
Right.
else there wouldn't be any engine
Right, right. And
of history or creation if you weren't constantly trying to undermine what was.
exactly. It's like what Zizek says in the Jordan Peterson debate about the jealous husband, right? Even if the wife was cheating, it wasn't that like, because she's like a cheater. It's the fact that like the husband needs to justify his pathological jealousy. And that's what like Peterson is. It's like he needs to justify the pathology that there's some like enemy out, a big other out there that is these like so-called postmodern neo-Marxists, which
What
justify
what do
like
they want? They want
yeah,
to destroy the family. Why? Just
yeah.
because.
But and you see him breaking a machine breaking down like in an interview, crying about music, crying about the crime of being.
But what's interesting though is with the cultural Marxists, it's like, what do they really want? All right, we
Yeah,
say they want to destroy the family, they want to
family. They want
destroy
to.
society, but why? To what end?
So what? Yeah, what's
Well,
the
like there is no reason. But what? And this is where like the idea of the quilting point and symptom comes in, where it's like, well, what he's homing in on is something that, again, jouissance serves no purpose.
yeah,
The issue is that what we struggle with is the acknowledgement of something that serves no purpose
yeah,
in
yeah,
our
yeah.
society, because we cannot detach ourselves from this way of thinking of things that serve a purpose and are efficient and have some meaning. So uh, the crisis that we experience is overabundance of everything meaning something.
Right.
And you would think, well, in Christian societies in the past, the world was in this like Weberian sense of enchantment and this
Right.
horizon of enjoyment that existed in the past, of the world was just this enchanted garden and we moved away from that. I don't think so. I think that actually, if there's any, again, it's all imagined. We don't know what the ancients or the people in the Middle Ages really, how they really experience life, but maybe if there's any merit to that, it's more so not so much that the world had so much meaning because it was like, oh, they were so connected with God and everything. Like, no, most people probably
Weren't.
they
No,
weren't
it's like
they
it
weren't
all goes
they
back
weren't openly atheistic, but they were sinning all the time in a world where sin was everything. They like
yeah.
probably didn't give a shit in a lot of ways. But the thing is, they also were able to create allowance for the notion of something which served no purpose. Because if you think about it, for them, do you
Right.
think they were thinking about God in this Kierkegaardian or Lutheran sense of like, what does God want of us? And like most people back then,
Right.
I
Yeah.
doubt that most people were like, what they would have seen God as something that was real and determinative, but also purposeless in a sense. So
Right.
you have to think that, like, for them, life, it's not, oh, we live in this nihilistic age. There's this crisis of meaning. What is it's like? No, their age was nihilistic, but in a different sense. They believe
Exactly. And
God.
Nietzsche points this out too, to an extent. But I think sometimes he kind of fetishizes like the Greek and Roman tradition and like the warrior and priestly caste a little too much of like what constitutes a healthy culture, etc. But that's exactly right. But I also want to point out, like, what is it that we always say in Hegel? Hegel said this, that the mysteries of
Yes,
Egypt were mysteries for Egypt
yes,
themselves.
yes, yes, and that's the thing. The mystery of God was also a mystery for the medievals, in the sense that,
Yeah.
like, I think that, how did I put it? That we think we have a monopoly on nihilism
Right.
today.
Like we just now we're in this position where like we fell so back and we're just in these dark times and we need to go back. We need to connect with our roots. It's almost like in the same way of like how people fetishize like indigenous cultures, like if they hate
Yes,
Abrahamic faiths, it's like they're a
exactly.
little more connected and this and that. But it's when you look at it, it's like, no, they're not. Like even them, like they didn't know everything. It's like that's why they're always resorting with these like exaggeration of rituals, and even when they didn't have the answer, they did these divination rituals to try to appeal to the quote unquote ancestors, as if the distant past has the kernel of truth to help them in their present
Yeah,
calamities.
yeah, because you rob them of a certain kind of subjectivity if
Right.
you disallow the possibility that they might think their own rituals are stupid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What would you make of that? Like, this idea, that's what makes a ritual, is not that, oh, everyone believes that everyone is like one with it. Maybe even the people are participating are like, I don't want to do this. I'm tired of this
Exactly.
fucking ritual again. This is stupid as shit, but like it has to be done.
It's the same thing with the Navy too. In the military, it's like these rituals of like standing at quarters, the Sailor's Creed, or like being in ranks, and like the plan of the day. Everybody's disgruntled about it, but it's like it has to be done.
Has to be done. And the stupidity of it
Yeah.
is actually what makes it, gives it its binding force. That's what
Right.
people
Even
understand.
if
It's
you
like,
have a cynical joke about it and make fun of it, it still gives it more power. Like making fun of Trump, making fun of Biden gives them more power that way.
exactly, like
Yeah.
Trump's appeal, his charisma comes from the fact that, well, one, he doesn't give a shit about people saying he's, I mean,
Yeah.
he does in some sense care about people saying he's stupid, but like he doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And the people who like all this fucking, like, I'm not pro Trump. I don't like Trump at all, but I'm not trying to defend him here. But like, also don't. I also think it's lame as shit that like Colbert types, all this like talk show hosts, like endlessly mock him in a way where
Yeah.
it's kind of like, dude, you seem dumber than him
Exactly. Yeah.
by making fun of someone who's like immune to criticism.
Yeah. Exactly.
That, I don't know. I think I don't know what that is. I guess it's like, that does have to do with this. I don't know why I always feel the need to justify how this ties back into the text itself. But here's your example, by the way, of the slave thing. Is brilliant. There's no
Yeah.
energy calculations in the use of slaves. But I wanted to already forget whether I pointed this out, but did I already say this? God, I'm getting older, but like, I love this quote: machines are something else. They go much further in the direction of what we are in reality, further even than people who build them suspect. I love that idea
Yes.
that
Yeah.
they go further than we do in what we are.
Right. Right. And it's like, and it's kind of funny because it's like then we conform to the machines, and it's like this whole like thing. It's like then you get this paranoia of like, oh, cyber, was it a Skynet, and the machines are gonna take over. But like, no, it's just like this paranoia of just like how much power we give like technology, but it still runs our lives because it's like people could be like, oh, I just need to get rid of my phone, or a therapist could tell you like you're on your phone too much. You need to like go out in nature and take a walk and breathe some air or meditate. But
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
you could say that from like a privileged position, but you don't realize that how much like a society functions off your cell phone. You can't get a job unless you have a fucking cell phone, because it's like how are you gonna know when you got the job if the employer can't call you, if you can't have an email address, all these things, right? Even if we say, oh, it still doesn't run my life, at the end of the day it does in the way that you function, right? But the point that I'm trying to make is that there are like people, like for instance, like mechanics and stuff like that, that revolve around this. Like, I just love working on cars. I just love working on engines. And they can only revolve their life on the metaphor of like, well, when things break down, I investigate it and I tune it and I fix it and I can run better.
Yeah.
Right. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that the whole perception of like your average dad culture?
I
They love it's tool time, it's Tim
full time
Allen,
Tim
it's
Allen.
they love, dads, they love fixing stuff.
Being a Tim
They
Allen.
like to work on the house, they love home improvement. That's all it is. That's what a dad is.
Right.
And
And then they're not doing that. You know what they're doing? They're sitting on the couch with a cold beer,
exactly. That's what I was
watching the
gonna say.
tube, watching the tube, which is a machine
That's what guys do. They watch,
plugging in.
yeah, and they're concerned with what
Right.
works, what can be fixed, what can be improved,
Right. What like
and they
functions.
pour themselves into that.
Right.
And there's like a kind of, in this sitcom scenario, there's a kind of cuteness to
Right.
the husband. Yeah, he's got a beer belly and he could be in better shape, but he cares and he's handy and I can rely on him to fix things. And it's,
Right. Right.
but these are problems that you created for yourself because it's
Right.
like you live in this. I don't know, me personally, like I don't dream about owning a home because that, like, to me, the idea of a bunch of shit that could go wrong,
Yeah.
I have no desire to,
Right.
like, that. I don't get any kind of libidinal pleasure from fixing things.
Right.
um Maybe I
Anything
could,
like a
maybe at a certain
maybe
age, maybe
like anything, it's like a phobia because of just like so like the burden of proof of just things just going wrong. Right.
I'd rather do this. I'd rather create problems for myself talking to you about Lacan and trying to fix it, which
But
maybe is analogous rather than something concrete and physical that has
I'm gonna
material
pull
consequences.
I want to pull the McGowan card and like Ryan, but don't you think? But doesn't this kind of like recall like in the movie Matilda, like how the dad is just like a sleaze and he just like sells people broken down cars and like his life is like a shit show. But
Nice.
like
I haven't seen that
you
in so
know, he
long.
plugs in like we're talking about the metaphors of like what does the dad do? Like to further like they tune into the TV or they plug into the TV. These are like machine metaphors, right? But when he tells Matilda when she's reading a book, it's like, what are you doing? Reading a book. What is this? It's Moby Dick. Moby what? And he's like, dinner time is family time. And family time we watch TV.
That's a good, but no, I like the idea. It's that because the TV is more like the clock. It always works.
Yeah.
You don't get any enjoyment from fixing the TV.
Exactly. Yeah.
When the in the old trope of like the fixing the antenna or whatever, when the TV doesn't work, everybody's
Everybody's upset. Yeah.
mad. There's
Yeah.
nothing that's supposed to work.
Yeah.
When it comes to, I don't know, nailing boards or whatever, like
Right.
everything
Yeah.
else, it just goes to show you how handy I am. I'm like, that's the only example that comes to mind. But um there are no, but I love this. There are no examples of energy calculations in the use of slaves. Here, this is where we get into not Lacan's Marxism, but where Marxism can plug right into
Mm.
some of this
Mm.
thinking in a way that is truly unique.
Well, even if you look at Marx's Grundrisse, he believed that like a sort of concept of automation of like the machines taking on a life of their own.
But the frightening thing, though, is not this iRobot vision of like
No,
that
right.
that they'll take. I mean, it could happen, but like that they'll. I mean, because what's so scary about being killed by a zombie versus a robot by it versus a speeding car?
Right.
Who cares? You're gonna get killed either way. You're gone. No, no, like there's not a specific glamour to being killed by a robot versus a speeding car. It's all death, but it's more like this idea that in machines, again, we see what we are.
Right.
There's this idea that
It's uncanny kind
what
of, right?
makes like 2001 a great movie is not this idea of the, oh, maybe we've uh made this Promethean error, that like we've gone too far in this Promethean sense of overstepping the bounds of what exactly, I don't know. Like that's not so much an interesting theme to me or interpretation of like this idea of technology run amok, so much as when you think about Hal in 2001, how Hal in some sense embodies the subject.
Right.
That's what's interesting. It's sort of like, but you think, oh, but Hal doesn't have these stories of inner richness that we can discover in ourselves. It's like, well, no, maybe these machines get exactly what Lacan says are what we are, but
Right.
even more than us.
And even more than this, and it's like not just fetishize it, but to be phobic about it and try to be like the Industrial Revolution was like the leading death of like society, yada yada. To be like a Kaczynski simp, it's like you end up running into
Yeah.
that error of like trying to romanticize like this myth of like primitive culture and how things are just much more simpler, and it's because of technology that it's like ruining like man's wholeness. It's like, well, no, like it actually both alienates us and it shows us like what we are more than ourselves, and it becomes, if maybe I'm using the term wrong, but almost uncanny.
Uncanny. No, uncanny
Yeah.
is the perfect word for it. It is the uncanniness of Hal in 2001 that strikes fear in our hearts, because that is the perfect unblemished mirror of what we are in some sense. The
Yeah.
frightening thing is not that we can't see ourselves, but we see ourselves too clearly
Yeah.
in the mirror of machine, the mirror that machines represent.
Right.
And
And like, no, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, it's just like the idea is that, well, on one hand, machines have always existed, and you can pinpoint, the creation of the steam engine or the internet or whatever as like the point where things changed. People say these phones are really fucking us up.
You're
And
right.
remember a time before phones, it's like Mark Zuckerberg through Facebook has really fucked up society. I'm
Yeah.
not saying he hasn't, but it's sort of like, but the people who say like they're missing something really important, which is that the acceleration of technology, the development of technology is, I don't even know exactly what I'm getting at. I feel like I already said it
No, I
to an
think you're
extent,
right.
but
I think you're right though in saying this because it's like, right, like, oh, phones fucked up everything, technology fucked up everything, but it's just like, if you look at like the 70s, 80s, and like the early 90s, right? Like people were still latched on to technology. Sure, like if you look at like this 80s nostalgia shit, like everybody was going to the mall, everybody was hanging out, going rollerblading or ice skating, after high school. I remember when we went on dates and we asked the girl out. It's like none of that's changed. Like things are still like that, but it's like the apparatus of capture or the deterritorialization of all these things have now reterritorialized onto the internet, and people are social still. Even those that call themselves anti-social are still social. They're just not physically talking to people. They don't want to be in crowds. They want to be in an area where they can get followers and be able to, like, I don't know, share memes or DM people. Like it's still social. It's just taking on a new form based on the new technological devices.
also everybody was saying, oh, well, back then we had to go out and like actually
Yeah.
meet people
Yeah.
and talk to people that like they're all people who ended up procreating and
Yeah.
having children. Like, you think there weren't incels back then too?
Right.
There just
Yeah.
weren't forums and communities for them, but it's like
Yeah. It is. Yeah. It's through the fact of social media that now they have communities like for it, and they can talk about
which
man.
is terrible. But anyway, I don't know that.
It's funny, but no, but like it's not getting too far because it just shows how, like, again, if machines symbolically or actual technology, still, whether we're talking about technology or we're talking about biology, they're not things in themselves. They are bonded by the machine of language, right? To not take
Yes,
into
yeah,
account
yeah.
is to get into these weird dualisms of like no longer body and soul or mind and body, but rather machine and body type thing.
And I think this is why Deleuze insists on this idea that the machine is not a metaphor. I really like this because it goes in line with what Lacan's saying here. The machine is not a metaphor in that we can see the symbolic as a machine and we don't have to view it as a useful metaphor. The symbolic literally is a machine.
Right. Yeah. And
And that before the creation of steam powered machines or electrically powered machines, a machine existed from the start. There
right.
is no, the whole idea is that when we look at our phones, when we look at the internet, when we look at what we're doing right now, we think of something that's qualitatively different from anything that has ever existed before it. What does it mean? Where is it going? What does it open us up to? Yeah, like there's some truth to that, but there is a disavowal also in that the machine has always existed and it didn't depend on an inventor to
Yeah.
exist. Imagine a machine that has always existed on its own. That would be one, like the human body, and
Right.
two, the symbolic order. And these are two different machines that can never really
Oh,
line up.
yes. Yes. And that's like the main thing too. And they both show how we break down. We break down without it, and it breaks down, and it needs our help. So like it's like, and what I was gonna say, it's like not only should we talk about machines, but we should also talk about the image as well and the ego, because what was Lacan saying earlier about like thanks to cameras and photography and like you could record an image, so it's no longer what was considered a subjective phenomenon of like the rainbow is considered purely subjective with with thanks to the invention of the camera and photography, that you could capture this. So it really kills this notion of a purely subjective phenomenon and now has an objective status. So there's also a relationship now between the image and the machine. Now, not only in the ego and symbolic order of language, but also in the image and even the technology. I was about to bring up like something like what Guy Debord says. It's like we're no longer mediated by things, but now like people mediated by images. But the image takes its life in a machine. Look at like the phones and Instagram and the algorithm, right? The symbolic algorithm of the language of the algorithm and how it captures an image. So therefore, you have a new form of mirror staging.
But people will say, I think it was actually Ryan Angley on Why Theory. He always points out the fact that the algorithm is also dumb as shit. People like the algorithm. It does something. It has
Yeah,
effects. I don't want to dismiss that, but it's also like fucking stupid, like the shit that it comes up with. Like when I see, like, maybe I'm just too good for the algorithm. Maybe I'm just so fucking brilliant that the algorithm can't get me. But like when I see the shit the algorithm recommends to me, I'm like, that I don't want any of this.
but isn't it interesting to see, like, if the algorithm's that dumb, we should take it. It's like just like language. It's referential upon whatever hashtags you use. And look at like when I was talking about like, yo, why did my Zizek meme get reported as hate speech? And
Which,
like,
by the way, just for context, Andrew's meme had the phrase "all men are trash,"
yeah,
which you'd think that would fly,
but
but and then
and
had a great clip of Zizek from the Four Discourses lecture, I think, with
yeah.
and S carry the one like type.
Sorry, S is right.
Sorry, I talk too much.
Yeah, and the whole caption was her, all men are trash. What do you have to offer to the table if I date you? And it's like me, and it's the Zizek trying to map out the four discourses. But yeah, it got reported twice because the algorithm said that it could be assumed as hate speech. It's like it just shows like in some way that when the algorithm becomes referential to itself and other things, that's probably why. Like it has nothing to do with like, oh, it's Zuckerberg, it's the metaverse, and just like, oh, yada yada. Because like even the algorithm takes on its own life beyond somebody of like the founders of Instagram and even like Zuckerberg and Facebook. It's like Zuckerberg acts as a displacement for the reality that the algorithm and the censorship takes on a life of its own. It's not like there's somebody purposely out there like literally trying to like report you half of the time. Sometimes if it's in the comments, it could be somebody actually using the tool reporting, but in some cases, is that really effective of some person actually reporting new? It's actually no, the algorithm doing its job more than you because it does take on a life of its own. And one like the last thing I'll say is like even the fact that like with when we click on something, it's like, do you give this app access to your microphone and your camera, right? And then like there becomes a lawsuit. It's like, oh, my freedom is being invaded by these apps, and like the whole thing about like whether or not this is true, but like Zuckerberg was like on a Zoom court case about like somehow like whatever company is related to Facebook was somehow extracting information from people. People were catching on and they didn't like that. So like he was on this like lawsuit. I didn't know anything about it. Like whether or not he's telling the truth, it's the fact it's like these things take a life on their own that ultimately goes beyond like the strings of Zuckerberg.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's there's a fetishism of these figures.
Right.
We like to focus on how creepy and reptilian they are, and it's funny, but it's also it draws attention away from the idea of this sort of
Right.
undead reality of the symbolic order itself and what that means, because it's much easier to have a face that you can attach to the culprit. But it's like with I really like Gen Z's sense of humor because they have the best memes. Not
Right.
the ones we do are more like
Niche as fuck.
Well, they're niche, but they're also like kind of formulaic to the degree that like we rely on certain templates. And well,
Yeah.
I should just talk about myself here, but like I like the really like absurd ones that Gen Z has, which get so absurd and so out there to the point where I feel like their sense of humor really highlights the malfunctioning of the symbolic order, in the
Right, right,
sense that
right, right.
they perceive that element of it that is really important to acknowledge, which when I say the stupidity of the signifier, to me, it doesn't mean there's not an effectivity to it or it doesn't have very serious consequences, but it's still very stupid in a
Yeah.
sense. Stupidity is also a very important thing, a very important concept in Lacan, even though he doesn't use the word stupidity all that much. But there's a stupidity to all of this. There's a stupidity even to the whole process of psychoanalysis, in that the way the subject is attached to, glued to certain signifiers, means the signifier itself in its materiality is something kind of stupid and dumb and pointless and doesn't mean anything in itself. And the whole thing is, it's like, yeah, psychoanalysis is all about trauma, it's true, but the problem with trauma culture, for example, is that it's very, again, to take a note from Deleuze, very Oedipal in terms of the
Right.
theater of it, where it's kind of like, this thing happened to me, not to dismiss anyone's experience of what happened to you, but what the good analyst will do is, even in reconstructing the scene of your trauma, not get
Right.
seduced by the scene itself, but focus on the materiality of the signifiers, which is that, like,
Exactly.
you're caught in the teeth
Right.
of a set of signifiers, which are not to be, they're not good, they're not bad, they're not anything, they're just these stupid material semantic monstrosities.
Exactly. Monstruction to take
Constructions.
yeah, to take a word out of your book, but like
I didn't say it. You made that up.
you slipped it.
Did
But
I?
yeah. And but like I really like what you were like talking about like trauma culture and like therapy culture and all these different identities that you want to see, like that you see now because of like therapy culture and the subgroups that come out of it, uh the autism identity, ADHD culture, and they're all falling in line with the DSM-5, right? And it's just like, it's not like these this is being rebelled. In fact, it feeds definitely perfect. It justifies the DSM-5, and you will get some like some therapist, um, some CBT practitioner that will like listen to their patient and say like, yeah, I have, I just feel ADHD, and they're like, yeah, yeah, and and like they'll give their own advice about it and like what they studied, and never really listen to the speech the way an analyst does. Never regard the transference. Um, and what I want to say about it is that the fact it's like, it's the trauma had nothing to do with the past, right? And the trauma never has to deal with like, oh, the fact that like, as a child I experienced this. You could experience something traumatic, what can be signified as traumatic even in your adult life. But the thing is that the trauma is not something that happened in the past. It's forgotten. It's the fact that it comes up in a fantasy that you don't want to fantasize about, and it resists symbolization, and it always happens more along lines in weird nightmares that you don't know how to fabricate a response to, right?
But Andrew, it really happened to me.
Yeah,
That's what people say. But Andrew, how
exactly.
could you say that? It really happened to me? No, it's not whether did it. It's not about whether it really happened to you. It's the idea that the signifiers you're using
Yeah,
to reconstruct it, whenever
exactly.
there is no memory that exists apart from the signifiers that constitute it.
Right.
It exists on its own.
Yeah, and going back to like this critique of therapy culture and stuff like that, I like my boy, Gabor Mate. I think he's doing some like decent work. He's
Yeah.
more alternative than like a Peterson bro, but he still falls in this era of like trauma being considered like slowly in the past. And then uh this is why you resort to addiction. It's because of trauma as a child. You weren't loved. And like, oh, why is it that, two kids that were raised by the same parent, one, goes to law school and is successful and the other one's an alcoholic? It's because nobody was raised by the same parent. That's definitely true. Like, I agree with you, Mate. Like, I like your analysis and like, oh, like comparing like the literature of like scientific psychology, talking about like, oh, 100 people go into war, but why is it that only 20 of them come back with PTSD and the other 80 of them don't? It has to do with trauma that started at childhood. It falls into this thing of a developmental epistemology, and he doesn't take his epistemological framework into account to consider what is the possibility of diagnosis of trauma, and that could be in relation to a causality of addiction. He falls into psychic causality.
But what I would wonder though, in that example, like what's interesting is not the traumatized person. Show me the person who doesn't need therapy then.
Yes.
I want to know who is this untraumatized,
person,
adjusted, adapted subject. That's the most fascinating person to me, because that is like whoever that person is fucking Norman Bates.
Right.
That's like fucking who's the guy from American Psycho? Like
Patrick Bateman.
Patrick Bateman.
Yeah.
That's Patrick Bateman then.
That,
like the non-traumatized person is Patrick fucking Bateman.
The one who refuses therapy, the one that feels like they're non-duped, the one that feels like they're perfectly fine. Especially when
he's the most adapted person though.
Exactly.
Like that is that's success right there. That's the adapted person.
Right. Right. And the fact that there are people that don't adapt to the military is a displacement of the fact that there are people that thrive off of murder, of being subjectivized, and even being willing to break down other people and accumulate more people that are willing to follow orders and not think, right? And to go to war to kill somebody who's supposed to be the other. That is the enemy that's supposed to take away your possibility of freedom and salvation, right? That is definitely, and the fact that it's like, like they came back from war and then they re-enlist. So therefore, if there's this jouissance of and like perversion of killing people, and like the disavow is like, oh, they're taking away my freedom. They don't represent America. They're communist, or they're Islam and they're not right, and yada yada yada. The list goes on, and it's just like, that's like a perfect, because I never thought of it like that. It's not about the person that's maladaptive or comes back with trauma. It's the people that don't, because they exist. And they are maintaining the status quo.
No, the person who's the most adapted to this society is the most terrifying person you'll ever meet. Mm-hmm. I think that's what American Psycho is about in many ways. Like, this is adaptation to capitalism.
Right. And it's a perversion. And it's just like,
so you tell me, like, the thing you need to know about me that's like the most definitive of my personality is I'm traumatized. I've had a traumatic upbringing. That, again, that's not to dismiss anyone's like specific trauma, because obviously people have undergone traumas that I can't even imagine what it's like. I'm not dismissing trauma, but I'm dismissing trauma as like that's your defining feature. Right. I am trauma. Yeah. It's like, well, of course, trauma. There's a fetishism of trauma in that, like, right. The idea is that, so back to the machine and language and the symbolic order. The genius of Lacan here is that he says trauma is not the specific details of what happened to you. Trauma is language. Right. Language is trauma. Language is traumatic. Language is not simply a way of coping with trauma, which people can get to that point. Like, oh, well, you use language in a way to cope with the trauma that you've experienced. It's like, no. Language is
right. And what it makes it traumatic is the point that it fails to signify the construction of your identity. It's that point of failure and resistance is like you don't have the words, especially in analysis, the words that you don't have, you resort to silence. And it's like that silence not only is it awkward, but it's like then you have the analyst that's just observing you, and like then the suspense and the trauma builds up because you don't have the words, or you refuse to work through to create words, because then it takes you away from the comfortability of the signification that you had before. Because it's not about like, oh, I have trauma. It's the fact it's like, well, you could say that only like what you're saying, like, oh, but Andrew, I literally experienced this. There's no such thing as literal. Everything is metaphoric. It's all signification. But when I break away the signifier chain to the signifier that you hold on to and leaves you in this impasse to develop new metaphors, that is more traumatic, especially in analysis, because now you have to work through that. And that's the haunting of language.
The haunting of language. I like that. The haunting of language, that hearing back. I don't know if any of you have had any kind of psychotropic experiences in this regard, especially maybe with, I don't know, cannabis, where you hear what you say in a way that it reverts back onto you, and the echo of it is really
Right.
intense. There's like this echo that's really intense. And there was a time in my life where I was like, well, I want to be able to get past that point of like having to deal with the echo of it,
Right. Right.
as opposed to accepting it as part of the human condition, as part of the body, as a machine, as part of the message that in the next chapter we're going to get at, the message that is registered by the machine and gives it, well, regulates the ballet, right? That's what we talked about in the chapter
Right.
before this. The voice. All right, we need to wrap this up.
Is this a
Really
no?
good.
Hey, we need to definitely mark timestamp where we started talking about like Gabriel Maté and trauma, and make a separate clip for this, because this is itself a fire ass conversation, right?
Let's get Gabor Mate on here.
Hey, that'd be pretty cool. That'd be pretty cool.
I like him a lot, actually.
Yeah,
I
he's
think
like a
he's
genuinely down to earth guy, really approachable, really nice to talk to, definitely knowledgeable about the
I
science.
think he's a good sort of connective tissue between
Right.
what we're doing
Psychoanalysis and like just like therapy
and
culture,
basically like psychotherapy.
he's that perfect
I think
medium.
he's the guy. I what?
He's that perfect medium of like
Yeah.
people who are not duped to psychoanalysis, but like, there's this contradiction in like therapy culture with CBT. I think he's like that perfect medium that really understands.
Is that absolutely?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
But like as Dave says, I think his failure is that he resorts to PMC language and doesn't take it far enough. I agree.
Well, that's everybody, right?
That's
Who doesn't? Of course he's not gonna take it far enough.
I liked his the framework, at least to the start of the Realm of Hungry Ghost. I don't know how his book on the myth of normalcy starts off, but definitely saying that there's no such thing as normal, that everybody's mentally ill. Psychoanalysis
well, that's good against adaptation,
right?
Against adaptation.
Or fucking DNG. We are all schizo. We are all perverts. I like that one better.
That's cool. Like, and we can have Cody on here to act as a foil to us, but there's still I feel like with them, there's still a kind of grandiloquence to it that leads to another kind of theater.
Yeah.
Which is, I haven't finished Anti-Oedipus yet, but the schizoanalysis becomes kind of like, why is that not another kind of theater in a sense?
It really is theater of machines. I got a shout out to my sister Sarah, but she's reading it in Portuguese. She's reading Anti-Oedipus, and she was asking, she's like, bro, what does this mean? Like, I'm so confused, my head hurts, I feel like I'm going insane reading this.
Anti-Oedipus is fine. Like, as someone who's studied literature, creative writing, it's just fun to read. Like, you don't have to understand it. I don't understand it, but it's just like,
it's just
so love good. The way it's written.
It's just so like
fucking good. Yeah. It's so good. Dude, like with
If I
the
had like
savages, barbarians, and civilized men is like one
fire.
of the best things I've ever read. So fucking sick.
If like you know how like Gregory Sadler has those two episodes, like 5 books I would take in a desert if I was abandoned, like in a desert, or like 10 books I would take. Like I think Anti Oedipus would be on my list, definitely.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, like
Hell fucking I can't wait to that's a book I'm gonna reread again
yeah,
and again. Maybe we
yeah,
could have Cody and uh uh
Maddie.
Maddie on here again. Yeah. Well, we need to do the second
The
chapter of
sanity check one, but yeah, like in the future, I want to do a Anti Oedipus one because it's such a good book.
the well, our last thing I'll say before we miss it here, where he talks about the brain as a dream machine.
Right.
You know, here's the fascinating thing is that the symbol, again, this is where the Hegelian piece is, the symbol not being able to be what it is generates it spawns itself into a million different forms that in everyday life and waking life we're able to instantaneously sort of synthesize what we see in a way that unites the body with
Right.
phenomenological experience. But in the dream, we get a feel for the form that's all like the whole idea is that it's not it's not like you get to see the primary process at work. No, like you never get to see the primary process at work, but what you get in the dream is something that alludes to the form itself of the kind of syntheses that go into
Right.
everyday experience in the sense that there's a detachment of that corporeality and the formalization of uh, uh, phenomena. It's like you get to experience that formalization immediately in a
Right.
strange
Right.
way. And that's why a dream feels very true and real in that like you are seeing the symbol itself in its own like the way cells divide. I feel like the symbol divides itself from itself.
Yes. Yes.
And you see how mean like the whole point of Freud is just like kind of like, well, oh, he's obsessed with sex, whatever. Like his the whole point is that you have when you have no hierarchy of meanings, of kinds of like different and again, this is where Deleuze and Guattari would say, like, yeah, of course not, because it's like the whole thing is when you think about different tiers of meaning, different levels or echelons of the hierarchy, um, then you're already submitting to a hierarchical vision of the world, in terms of like a kind of power politics, whatever you want to call it, without getting too Foucauldian about it. But like the whole idea is that you have different kinds of meaning that you wouldn't think as well. First of all, you wouldn't even isolate certain forms of meaning as being that as such. Only in the dream do you get this sort of blending of different, not just different meanings in terms of like, oh, well, this means one thing and this means another thing, but also different formalizations of meaning that become one another, that blend in such a way where it's like you get, Mikey pointed this out to me. This is why Mikey's a genius, because it's like he says, why don't people pay more attention in the formula for fantasy to the lozenge, which is the
Yeah.
conjunctive,
Yes. 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 Yes.
conjunction, disjunction, greater than, less than. That is actually the heart of it. Everyone looks at the object A, the subject, but the lozenge is what actually regulates one's specific relationship to object A, in that like it's shifting, it's stood on its head, it's inverted, whatever. Like it's actually the movement of that. You see that in the dream where it's sort of like there are no power politics in a sense. The dream
Right.
is truly communistic in that sense. It's like
Yeah.
there's a true equality among all of the different elements involved in the dream, to the degree that there's here's where the malfunctioning of it goes wrong, because the dream feels wrong, but it also feels very true at the same time. It feels wrong, and one of the thing about that nightmare, for instance, waking up from a nightmare is such a relief, because you think, oh, that's not real, it's not
Right. Right.
reality, it's not true, I don't exist in that world, thank God. However terrible my waking life might be, I don't exist in that world. But at the same time, it's like, well, there's some the truth to be gained from not just the dream, let's say the nightmare. The truth
Right.
gained from the nightmare
Or
is
a
a sort
night
of,
terror in which you're constantly having it. It's constantly like nagging at you in different ways.
it is the leveling of all of the main, how would I put, elements of your waking life in a way that even the greatest artist couldn't quite
Right.
figure out. Uh,
Right.
I don't know if I'm saying anything.
No, but like it makes it like it's usually like not just like the nightmare, but it's like the constant like night terrors that really allude to something of a truth that can't be symbolized, right? It's like it's out of the level of signification, but yet it still grips hold because like it's something that you can't put into proximity, but yet it just feels like you're you're un, you're not at ease, and yet like the thing that I cannot put into words or identify or locate continues to follow me.
Well, it's like what you're saying, like the thing you can't put into words, the ineffable. This is what we've been getting at. The ineffable, though, is not the silent. The ineffable is very much spoken.
Mm-hmm.
That's what people, the what's unspeakable is very much spoken. And in the same sense that the unconscious is what creates time, even though it doesn't know any time, it's the same thing with, I think, this idea of the ineffable, of it is very much spoken. And in the dream, in the symbol, we get what can't be spoken in its own very ugly, uh Mon's constructionist
Right.
way,
And it's like
is spoken.
in the way the ineffable, right? It's spoken, but it's just like certain signifiers take more precedence of it. It's only that one signifier that really aims close at what it is, right? The more you have to signify it, the more you have to speak about it, the more closer, the more the distance from that starts to pretty much shorten itself until you get close to that, which was resisting pretty much.
I think that
Yeah.
about does it.
Yeah. Definitely.
Until next time,
Shit. This was a fire.
Lacanini.
This is the fire ass.